31 AD, 3925 AM. By this time, the controversy over Jesus was widespread in Galilee, Samaria, and Judea. Though the Gospel account holds him as a king of the Jews, Jesus never made this claim, asserting that he was a king only. Others claimed he was a conqueror come to subdue the nations, to make them subservient to the Jews, but his message was not of a conqueror. In the Vatican archives is an account of an encounter between Pilate and Jesus before his trial. Pilate wrote that the Jews that hated Jesus were darker skinned and dark-eyed, while Jesus was fair-haired and fair-skinned. The Vatican archives have also yielded forth another account of Jesus, one very little known. A close friend of Caesar who was descended from an equestrian family named Vallius Paterculus wrote an extensive book called Historia Romania. Historians attest that Paterculus was once a widely known Roman historian. He had written about Mithridates, king of Pontus, and about the Trojan War. Vallius Paterculus wrote that when he was 51 years old, he passed through Judea on his way back to Rome after 16 years of military service. He wrote that he witnessed Jesus, that Jesus was the most interesting man he had ever seen, a curer of disease, helper of the poor, and raiser of the dead. He wrote that among the Jews it was a matter of controversy at that time as to who Jesus was, but the Roman statesman declared that he, quote, was more afraid of Jesus than of a whole army, unquote. The writings of Paterculus have not survived and are found only in quotations of other authors. However, this text was allegedly discovered by accident over 100 years ago among the Vatican archives. Scholars believe the citation a blatant forgery. Paterculus calls him Jesus of Nazareth, Nazareth being a later Christian invention. No place existed by this name. Jesus was a Nazarite, and this identifies him with being an Essene. Further, the miracles were also a later invention. The oldest reference to Jesus performing miracles was in the Epistle of Barnabas, dated circa 130 AD. Not even in all the writings of Paul in the New Testament is there a reference to Jesus performing miracles. The Essenes considered themselves to be the remnants of the true Israel. They believed in the teacher of righteousness who was killed and then rose from the dead, a prophet. As we will see, this was a very ancient faith. The Essenes and the Druids maintained the same faith. The Druids were the spiritual leaders and guides of the Gauls, and even as early as the 1890s, historians have noted that the Druidic faith was akin to Christianity. Isaiah the prophet declared that God would one day in the future, after 7th century BC, reveal his word to Israel not through the Hebrew they spoke at that time, but through another language. Quote, "For with stammering lips and another tongue will the Lord speak to his people," unquote. The ancient Hebrew word for stammering is Gael, which is the origin of Gaelic, the language of the Gauls of old, a tongue later preserved in early Scotland, Ireland, Wales, tongue of Manx. Gaelic was the Celtic mother tongue. Jesus was of pure Israelite blood of the royal family of Judah through the Cimmerian line, known later as the Gauls, living in Galilee, Gaulantius. His Israelite pedigree was at least 750 years removed from those living in Judea, known as Jews, a people distantly related who had amalgamated with Babylonians and Edomites. 1. The Poisoned King. 2. The Origin of Greek Civilization. 3. Archcote Volume, Vatican Archive. 4. History of the Christian Religion to the year 200. 6. The Gospel Truth. 7. March of the Titans. 8. The Bible Fraud. 9. The Evolution of the Idea of God. 10. Isaiah. 11. Tracing Our Ancestors. 12. Four Witnesses. 32 AD, 3926 AM. Jesus continued his ministry. The calendrics for this year are impressive. This was 10 judged time periods of 434 years, each since the Phoenix chronology began, when the pre-Adamic world was totally destroyed in 4309 BC, when Earth was shoved off its ancient orbit along the dark star's ecliptic. This was also 744 years, golden proportion number, after Earth's orbit was again slightly altered, changing the year from 360 to 365.25 days in 713 BC. As this was 776 years since the Israelites were deported into Assyria in 745 BC, where they became the Cimmerians of Samaria, this year is very important to the descendants of Israel. 33 AD, 3927 AM. Jesus declared that, quote, "I am not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel," unquote. Judah continued to honour the law and the prophets, though they added Talmudicism, and for this their strong affinity toward tradition. The Jews are easily identifiable in Roman times, as they are even 2,000 years later. The Jews have never been lost. All know who they are. The Jews assumed that the covenants belonged only to them, for they still possessed Jerusalem and their lot in the land of promise, they being totally oblivious that millions of people in those days dispersed throughout Asia, Africa and Europe were also the descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, Israel. To the Jews, the other countless millions were also to be ignored by God, those in deepest Africa, the Middle East, India and the Far East, and those rumoured to be living on the other side of the world. By excluding the whole world from the promises of God, the Jews cursed themselves when Jesus was taken to Pontius Pilate. The Jews cried, quote, "Let his blood be upon us and our children," unquote, as Pilate washed his hands of the matter. The Greek word lost in lost sheep is apolumai, which is made of root words meaning separated by punishment, apo and olumai. This was a reference to the 10 tribes of Israel deported in 745 BC for their worship of Baal and Asherah. Who the lost Israelites were is clearly seen in where the apostles travelled after Jesus was gone. As will be shown, the apostles of Christ travelled to all those lands where the descendants of Israelites were settled. Evidence that the lost Israelites no longer lived in Palestine only is found in that Jesus told them that they would not go over all the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. If Israel was only within the narrow confines of Palestine, then Jesus' message would have filled the land in months. But the Son of Man still has not come, and yet Christianity is spread throughout the world, with new cities inhabited by Christians being built all the time. This is because the Abrahamic covenant has been fulfilled, that the seed of Abraham would literally fill the earth. Jesus spoke before the synagogue and declared, quote, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord, and the day of vengeance of our God," unquote. This statement is the key to Jesus' message. It is a chronological statement and one totally ignored by Christian eschatologists. Ancient man was given a year-specific timeline of 6,000 years to the return of the chief cornerstone, a 6,000-year period that had a definitive beginning date of 3895 BC and ended in 2106 AD, 6000 Annus Mundi. Christian writers all too often proclaim that the timing of Armageddon is unknown and cannot be known, being God's secret, unaware that the 6,000-year countdown is discovered in so many ways. See 2106 AD. They say that we cannot know the time because Scripture reads, "No man can know the day nor the hour." However, there is no bar to knowing the year. Jesus is arrested after Judas betrays him for 30 pieces of silver, which was the price of a slave. Tradition holds that Pilate's wife was a woman of Gaul, France, and that she had a nightmare that revealed to her the supernatural divinity of Jesus, and begged her husband to have nothing to do with this man's death. Her dream specifically portended an earthquake and the darkening of the sun. The presence of a woman of Gaul married to a Roman official is not surprising. In 37 AD, Pomponius Mela of Tingentera wrote in De Chorographia that there had been some Gauls in France that had relocated, sailing east to Palestine. Philo of Alexandria was a Jew alive at this time who wrote a history, writing about Pilate, describing him as inflexible, merciless, and obstinate. Philo claimed that the Jews hated Pilate because of his severity, having ordered 100 crucifixions. The day Jesus was crucified, according to tradition, Gaius Cassius, later called Longinus, was a representative for Pilate, who reported on the religious and political scene in Jerusalem. Because the Passover was approaching, the Jews wanted the three men on the crosses to be dead by sundown, so they petitioned the Romans to break their legs. When the soldiers broke the legs of the two men on either side of Jesus, Gaius Cassius, in an act of mercy, stabbed Jesus in his side with a spear, fulfilling two Old Testament prophecies. Isaiah wrote that, quote, "A bone of him shall not be broken," unquote, and Ezekiel wrote that, quote, "They shall look on him whom they have pierced," unquote. The crucifixion of Jesus fulfilled an ancient motif. In human sacrifice in antiquity, the victim was bought for a price. The money paid absolved the people from guilt. The payment of a price to kill an innocent altered the act from murder to sacrifice. Jesus' price was 30 pieces of silver. The head of a sacrificial victim was anointed with oil, and Christ actually means anointed. It was important that the victim made no show of resistance, but had to accept his or her fate in order for the people to gain by the sacrifice. For this reason, drugs were often used to sedate the victim, and often, after sedated, the bones of the victim were broken so as to prevent struggling or resistance once the sacrificial ceremony began. This was all common knowledge in the days of Isaiah, giving more meaning to his prophecy that no bones of Jesus would be broken. This meant that his sacrifice was completely voluntary, even though it was also literally fulfilled. This willingness made Jesus the kinsman redeemer of those he gave himself for. Jesus was executed upon a stauros, a stake. Roman crucifixion was not on a cross, but on a stake that the victims were nailed to. The majority of Christian authorities affirm that the date for the crucifixion was 33 AD. The year 33 AD is itself quite unimportant, calendrically, under any calendar. While this is noteworthy, we turn here to the erudition of Oswald Spengler, who in his Decline of the West, concerning Jesus' statement, "My kingdom is not of this world," wrote, quote, "This is the final word which admits of no gloss, and on which each must check the course wherein birth and nature have set him. There is no bridge between directional time and timeless eternity, between the course of history and the existence of a divine world order," unquote. The Gematria specialist Bonnie Gaunt wrote that the value for the Greek word resurrection is 963, Greek being the language of the New Testament. It has already been shown that in 931 BC, Israel and Judah split into the two kingdoms, and that this division began a 3,000-year countdown to the resurrection event in 2070 AD. Interestingly, 931 BC also began a 963-year resurrection to 33 AD. While the crucifixion was a local event that had to rely on word of mouth and published mediums to spread abroad, the Gospel account also relates that a powerful earthquake and the darkening of the sun occurred at the death of Jesus. A review of this evidence is as controversial as the historicity of Christ. The Gospel account relates, quote, "Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land unto the 9th hour," unquote. This is a 3-hour period, a duration that completely rules out an ordinary eclipse, which lasts only minutes. This would require a large celestial object or thick dust cloud to transmit between Earth and the Sun, immersing the Earth in shadow. A simple local transit casting part of the Earth in shadow is also ruled out because of the 3-hour duration. The darkening of the sun was widely regarded by many nations in antiquity as the appearance of the phoenix, a great celestial bird in the heavens that flew into the sun, darkening it for a length of time before being reborn, emerging out of transit, freeing the sun. The Roman historian Tacitus lived closest to this time, within a decade or so, and he wrote that Phoenix appeared in what translates as the year 35 AD. However, translator and antiquarian Michael Grant, a prolific writer in histories, remarks that Tacitus was 2 years off from all other chroniclers. This refers to 33 AD and infers that the sun darkening was widely published in antiquity. The problem scholars have, and it is a legitimate one, is that it can be shown that regarding Jesus the writings of Tacitus had once been tampered with, as will be shown. Another red flag to the historians is the fact that the historians alive in that time, in that year, Flavius Josephus and Philo, both men writing extensive histories covering everything relative to the Jewish world at the time, but neither man recorded any darkening of the sun or earthquake for 33 AD. Neither did Pliny the Elder or Seneca, as noted by the historian Hazelrig. Both Pliny and Seneca lived at this time, and both men made a habit of recording all the known accounts of seismic activity and unusual phenomena. Hazelrig wrote, quote, "Nowhere do they mention the miraculous darkness which is said to have overspread the earth at the crucifixion. Neither do they make mention anywhere in their voluminous text of a man named Jesus." Unquote. As will be shown, the four Gospels that relate these events do not date any earlier than 160 AD. Before the appearance of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, there was a Gospel in existence called the Gospel of Marcion, an account of Jesus totally devoid of the fantastic that is reviewed under 144 AD. This appears to be the oldest known Gospel account, and in it we find that at the death of Jesus the sun was darkened. The miraculous birth, the Virgin Mother, miracles, the 3 days dead and resurrection and ascension into heaven, laden in the four Gospels, do not appear in the Gospel of Marcion, so the reference to the sun darkening here bears significance. In about 220 AD, almost 190 years after the events, Julius Africanus wrote that a non-Christian historian named Thallus in the year 52 AD, what translates as the year 52, had written that a fearful darkness and earthquake occurred over Judea. We have no surviving writings by this Thallus. In about 230 AD, Origen of Adamantius, a scholar of Alexandria and Christian historian, in Contra Celsum, wrote, quote, "But of the eclipse, which happened in the time of Tiberius, in whose reign Jesus was crucified, and of the great earthquakes which were at the time, Phlegon writes in the 13th, or as I think, the 14th book of the Chronicles." Unquote. The purpose of Origen's book was to argue against an enemy of the Church, Celsus, who, though against Christianity, nonetheless still recorded the sun darkening and earthquakes. Celsus was quoted by Rabbi Akiba, who wrote that a dark mist obscured the sun and the earth quaked. Phlegon was an historian and freedman of Hadrian, who wrote his works about 150 AD, about 120 years after crucifixion, books allegedly read by Vopiscus. Phlegon's account has been attacked by scholars for the known fact that no eclipses occurred at that time in 33 AD, no one considering that a dust cloud of gigantic object transited casting the world in shadow. We do not have any surviving copy of Phlegon's book. About 100 years after Origen, the church father and historian Eusebius also wrote about Phlegon's account. Eusebius wrote that Christ was crucified in the 19th year of Tiberius Caesar. This was exactly 33 AD. This is also the date provided by Phlegon according to Eusebius, quoting Phlegon's book Olympiads, a non-Christian chronology. In the 13th book of Olympiads, according to Eusebius, it reads, "In the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, there was an eclipse of the sun, the greatest of any known before, and there was a great earthquake in Bithynia, which overturned many houses in Nice." Also about 230 AD, Tertullian wrote that a record of the world portent of the sun darkening and the earthquakes was preserved in the archives of Rome. This record was also known to Justin Martyr, Eusebius and Jerome, who all claimed that Pontius Pilate wrote a record of the event. The Roman Church claims that this record was preserved as Pilate's report to Tiberius Caesar, which reads, "And when he was hanged, supernatural signs appeared, and in the judgment of the philosophers menaced the whole world with ruin. There was darkness over the whole world, and the sun was obscured half a day, and the stars appeared, but no lustre was seen in them, and the moon lost its brightness, as though tinged with blood, and the terror of the earthquake continued from the 6th hour of the preparation to the 9th hour. The sun was altogether hidden, and the sky appeared dark while it was yet day. Wherefore, I suppose, your Excellency is not unaware that in all the world they lighted their lamps from the 6th hour unto evening, and the moon, which was like blood, did not shine all night long, although it was at the full. So dreadful were the signs that men saw both in the heavens and on the earth, that Dionysius the Areopagite is reported as saying, quote, "Either the author of nature is suffering or the universe is falling apart." Unquote. This account claims that it was sent to Rome and read before the Senate. Scholars are well in agreement that the document is a forgery. In about 327 AD, in Against the Heathen, the historian Arnobius wrote, quote, "An earthquake shook the world, the sea was heaved up from its depths, the heaven was shrouded in darkness, the sun's fiery blaze was checked, and his heat became moderate. For what else could occur when he was discovered to be God, who heretofore was reckoned one of us?" Unquote. Arnobius was formerly an enemy of the Church, who had converted and then wrote 7 books against the pagans. Over 380 years after 33 AD, about 415 AD, Augustine of Hippo wrote in his celebrated City of God concerning the crucifixion of Jesus. The crime was indicated by this deprivation of the sun's light, as in truth was the case when the Lord was crucified through the cruelty and impiety of the Jews. For it is sufficiently demonstrated that this latter obscuration of the sun did not occur by the natural laws of the heavenly bodies, because it was then the Jewish Passover, which is held only at the full moon. Scholars are at variance over these accounts because they were all recorded by Christian historians. The non-Christian sources, Thallus, Phlegon, are only preserved by Christian historians, and the original works cannot be verified. Tacitus remains the best evidence, but Christian interpolation has already been documented in his writings, as will be shown. Even the relatively modern Book of Mormon continues to relate the same event. The Book of Mormon purports to be a translation of ancient records copied off golden plates, c. 498 BC, concerning the wanderings of ancient Israelites into early America. In 3 Nephi, and dated by Mormon scholars at 34 AD, we read that a terrible catastrophe occurred in the Americas of devastating winds, a storm, unusual lightning never before seen, earthquakes, the sinking of cities, altered landscapes, great depopulations followed by a vast darkness like a mist that hid the sun, moon and stars, lasting 3 days. Grant Allen in 1897 AD wrote in Evolution of the Idea of God, no more true a statement than this, quote, "When we look at documents so overloaded with miracles and legends as the Gospels and Acts of the Apostles, we find it hard indeed to separate any element of historical truth from the enormous accretion of myth and legend." Unquote. The origins of Christianity in fact antedate anything today considered Christian. All around the old world, long prior to Christianity, the belief that one man should die for the salvation of the people was widespread and thoroughly documented. Sometimes, after human sacrifice had ceased, the victim was replaced with an effigy, an idol, an artificially made god of the people that was scourged and tortured ceremoniously before being put to a mock death. In 170 AD, Melito, Bishop of Sardis, wrote a letter to Emperor Marcus Antoninus, informing him that Christianity was in fact of high antiquity, as having been imported from countries lying beyond the limits of the Roman Empire, arriving during the reign of Augustus Caesar. This assessment is taken up also centuries later by church historian Eusebius. Quote, "What is called the Christian religion is neither new or strange, but if it be lawful to testify as to the truth, was known to the ancients." Unquote. Strangely, there is more historical evidence in the story that the Gospel relates than there is evidence that Jesus even existed, a story long predated Jesus' lifetime. Horus was the son of Osiris of Egypt, and was called the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, the resurrection and the life, the Good Shepherd. Horus suffered, died and rose again to give men eternal life. It was as if the theology of Jesus was borrowed straight out of ancient Egypt. Horus was born of a virgin on December 25th, announced by the appearance of a star, and his birth was attended by 3 wise men. At 12 years old, Horus appeared at the temple and taught the elders. He was baptized, chose 12 disciples, witnesses, performed miracles, was transfigured on a mount, and was crucified between 2 thieves, buried for 3 days and resurrected. Horus was the way, the truth and the light, the Messiah and the Word made flesh. Horus came to fulfill the law. He He was called the Christ, Anointed One. All of the Gospel story was already known in the Egyptian faith of Horus, and they are found on the walls of the Temple of Luxor dated circa 13th century BC. In the pre-Christian Sanskrit dictionary, we find that the god Vishnu appeared on earth in human form as Krishna, having come down from heaven to remove the sin and misery from mankind. He was born into the world through the Virgin Devaki. His birth was announced by a star. He was born away from home, while his parents journeyed to pay a tax, he being the descendant of a royal family. At his birth he was recognized by cowherds and given presents. A prophet visited him after reading the stars, determining that he was indeed Krishna. Because a local king sought his death, he was taken to Gokul, a fact immortalized in the reliefs of the most ancient Hindu temples, which represent the flight at midnight when Krishna was an infant. Where he had been born, all the male children in the region were slaughtered, depicted in the huge sculpture of the cave temple of Elephanta. Krishna's father was a carpenter, and he astonished his elders with his learning. He became a healer of the blind and sick, diseased, and raised the dead. He chose 12 disciples, and a woman anointed his head with oil. He taught in parables and was transfigured. The evil one assailed him, but he prevailed. Krishna taught the Brahmins, priests, and he told his favourite disciple Arjuna, quote, I am the great sage, without beginning, I am the ruler, be not sorrowful. From all thy sins I will deliver thee. I am the cause of the whole universe. Through me it was created, I am its way and refuge, unquote. Krishna was crucified, arms extended, on a tree, holes depicted on his hands and feet. Another hole appears on his side. At his gruesome death a black circle appeared around the moon. The sun darkened and the sky rained fire and ashes. Flames burned and demons ran rampant upon the surface of the earth, and at sunset were clearly seen thousands of beings at war in the sky. Krishna was Vishnu in the form of a man, prophesied to return in the last days riding a white-winged horse, when the sun and moon darken at his approach. Krishna was immortalized as the Saviour, Redeemer, Comforter, and the Mediator, the Holy One and the Good Shepherd. It has been noticed by scholars that Hindu writings like the Chanakyaniti are echoed again in the Christian New Testament texts. The same is true of the Buddhist texts called the Dhammapada and the Daniya Sutta, which contain entire passages mirrored in the Gospels. This is a problem for the New Testament scholar, for Buddhism was established 500 years before Christianity, quote, and widely publicized throughout the Middle East, unquote. The Syrian city of Antioch is considered the capital of Christianity, where the movement began, Galilee being Lower Syria. It is known that at this time in the 1st century AD, Antioch was a haven for Buddhist concepts. Buddha was born on December 25th at the appearance of a star. Gifts were given to him and he was visited by wise men and declared ruler of the world. He taught in the temple at 12 years old, was baptized, performed miracles and healings, fed 500 from a small basket of cakes, abolished idolatry, was transfigured on a mountain, was killed and resurrected, ascending bodily into heaven. Buddha was called the light of the world, Redeemer, the Good Shepherd and the Alpha and Omega. He was to return in the latter days. Buddha was also called the Great Physician, the Only Begotten, the Word and the Way, living a life parallel to what was later said to be Jesus' life in the 4 Gospels. Amazingly, Buddha was called the Lion of the tribe of Sakya. In the biblical records, this title was Lion of the tribe of Judah. The Israelites that passed through Assyria were called by the house of Isaac, Bitsak or Saka, and many of those descended from Israel were deported and settled as far as northern India, called Aryans from their city of Arya. At the death of Buddha, the earth and rocks split. He descended into hell and preached to the spirits of the damned. He was buried but walked out of the tomb, ascending into heaven. This is also the story of Indra, the god of Nepal and Tibetan tradition, a god who spilled his blood for the salvation of mankind, and that his body was pierced through with nails. Though they claim he did not suffer the penalty of the cross, nevertheless they find pictures of this in their books. In Phrygia, the god Attis was the son of God worshipped at least by 300 BC. He was born on December 25th of a virgin. He was the divine Son and the Father in one. He was crucified and resurrected 3 days later to cleanse mankind, becoming the Most High God. He was the only begotten, the Saviour. This faith in Attis was maintained strongly in Galatia. In early Christianity, the new faith was readily accepted quickly in Phrygia among the worshippers of Attis, Galatia being located at Phrygia. Even the New Testament attests that Paul visited and taught the faith in Phrygia and Galatia in the book of Acts. Phrygia was occupied by the descendants of Israelites that invaded the region in 687 BC. Attis was a god parallel to Adonis, who shares the same traits. Adonis was the god of Byblos, of ancient Syria, origin of Christianity, and early Greece, a god imported by the Phoenician Hebrew migrants from Palestine. Adonis ascended into the heavens before witnesses. A different branch of Israelite descendants were nearby in Thracia, a people who worshipped Zalmoxis, god of Moses, the Saviour who promised eternal life to all at his Last Supper. He descended to the underworld and rose again on the third day. Also popular throughout the Greek world before Christianity was the god Dionysus, who was born on December 25th of a virgin, placed in a manger. He was a travelling teacher and miracle performer. He turned water into wine. Dionysus was a god of wine. He was called the King of Kings, the only begotten Son, the sin-bearer, and the Saviour, identified with a lamb. He was also called Iasius, or Jesus, and was the God-man of the Orphic mysteries of Samothrace. He was little different than Mithra, Hercules, and a host of other early gods. And on the other side of the world, the same story is told of the pre-Christian god Quetzalcoatl. He was the god of the Aztecs. He had disciples, observed a 40-day fast, was put to death and died for the sins of humanity after having been placed on a beam of wood with arms outstretched. He was sometimes represented in American art as crucified between two other victims, and in some images can be seen nail impressions on his hands. At his death the sun darkened. He descended into hell and rose from the dead. Because Christian researchers have been made aware of these older faiths, many have made valiant efforts attempting to show that Jesus actually travelled to India, Egypt, Phrygia, throughout the Middle East, the Far East, and even the ancient Americas. This concerns the supposed lost years of Christ, those 18 years of which the four Gospels are totally silent, from his 12th year teaching in the Temple in Jerusalem to his appearance in 30 AD. Jesus may have indeed travelled widely and studied with the Druids of Britain and Gaul, the Magi of Parthia and the Brahmins of India, but still his travelling cannot account for the high antiquity of the Gospel story. Because of this, another theory has been advanced, one that, if correct, implies indeed that Jesus did exist and was who he claimed to be. This theory holds that all of these ancient Gospel stories of Osiris, Indra, Mithra, Attis, Quetzalcoatl, Adonis, Horus, Dionysus, Hercules, Hermes, Baldur, among others, only became passed off as history after long periods of time, their original form being prophecies. The ancient mysteries of the dying God, the Saviour of mankind, who descended to the underworld under various names, were but fragments of an elder faith of prophetic glimpses of him and what he would accomplish among humanity. As F. C. Happold wrote in Mysticism, quote, "What had been before a myth became a fact of history. The reality glimpsed and expressed in ancient ritual and mythology was incarnate in the phenomenal world. The perennial dream of mankind became true." Unquote. In the years 1837 to 1825 BC, Abraham, Brahma, provided the sages of India and many others in Egypt a vast corpus of ancient prophetic information concerning the future histories of the world. The Apocalypse we call the Book of Revelation, at least its core material, is very old, as will be shown, and this information was known to Abraham. All the messages of the chief cornerstone were through Abraham given to the learned of those assembled to listen to Abraham, knowledges translated from off the surfaces of the Great Pyramid. These writings were the original pre-flood world of God, and they were composed in past tense, just as the prophetic passages in the Old Testament are often found written in past tense, like the narration of the book of Revelation. As the Word of God is eternal, the original composition in past tense served the purpose of being unchanging, especially in the distant future when all prophecies are fulfilled. The original scriptures do not change, for they were written in past tense to begin with. As the centuries and millennia passed, this method of eschatological preservation became misunderstood, cults and priesthoods mistaking what was to come with what they thought already happened. Entire religions were built upon the foundations of these oldest faiths into what occurred, the creation of a host of saviour gods. The crucifixion sacrifice began a 50-day countdown to the day of Pentecost when, according to Christian writings, the Holy Spirit descended upon the apostles and others, and they amazed those listening to Galileans speak in their own languages. This same 50 days paralleled the 50 days from the exodus of Israel from Egypt in 1447 BC, led by Moses, to Moses at Mount Sinai, receiving the law and covenant from God. The Israelites, as a sign to God, were to paint their doors with lamb's blood to be saved from the same death the Egyptians suffered. And now Jesus was called the Lamb that was sacrificed. Strangely, it was not until the year 692 AD that the Roman Church officially changed the Christian symbol of the Lamb on the cross to that of an actual figure of a man crucified. What makes this odd is that one of the first church fathers, one who actually aided in the development of early Christianity, and the authority of the Church of Rome was Irenaeus, and this man wrote, quote, "The Lord did not die on a cross, and that those who claim that he did do him great disservice. They rob him from the honour of teaching in his old age." Unquote. It is evident that the real historical Jesus is very different than what he was later made out to be. Even the earliest Christian histories make no mention of miracles performed by Jesus or his resurrection. Clement of Rome, a man who knew Paul and lived in the 1st century AD, makes no mention of Christ's miracles or the resurrection in his own writings. He was a prolific writer. Philo of Alexandria was a wealthy Jew who had travelled extensively. He was sent to Rome around 3940 AD from Egypt to seek relief from Emperor Caligula for Roman treatment of Jews in Egypt, in which he was unsuccessful. He had also visited Palestine. Philo wrote a huge book on history of the time that survives today, but there is no mention of Jesus. Not Jesus nor the gospel events can be found in the writings of the contemporary historians of the time. Plutarch, both Pliny the Elder and younger, his nephew Juvenal, Epicletus, Celsus, Plotinus, Porphyry, Tacitus, Philo, Seneca, Justus, Martial and Tiberius, all of the works of these writers have survived, and none mention Jesus or the events of the four Gospels. Josephus was the son of Matthias, a leading Jew of the time. In the writings of Josephus, Book 18 of Antiquities, there is mention of what Christian researchers claim is a reference to Jesus, and indeed on the surface it is convincing. Some believed it to be a blatant Christian interpolation, and this is exactly what has now been found to be the case. Many theologians believe Eusebius himself forged the passage in Josephus when he rewrote the writings of Josephus after the Council of Nicea in 325 AD. We do not have any copies of the original Antiquities, as is the case with other texts that mention Jesus. A perfect example of interpolation by later Christian translators appeared in Tacitus' writings, the Annals. Quote, "They had their denomination from Chrestus, who in the reign of Tiberius was put to death as a criminal by the procurator, Pontius Pilate." Unquote. We do not have the original book by Tacitus, but only a later translation. The falsity in the text is found when considering that Clement of Alexandria studied all the known texts in his day, even quoting Tacitus in his fervour to cite all sources that may have referred to Jesus. Clement not once cited this passage, and he would not have missed it had it have been originally in the text. Further, even Eusebius had missed this passage, which he would not have omitted either. In the biblical account, the trial of Jesus to his death was only hours, the whole of the trial, death and resurrection encompassing 3 days. But this is untenable, for under Roman law there was a 40-day waiting period to allow for anyone to come forth with exonerating evidence in order to prove the innocence of the accused. Condemnation in Roman law was not absolute, thus the grace period. These facts have been provided to show that a man of Galilee named Jesus, Yeshua, Joshua, may indeed have lived, taught, and died by crucifixion by the Romans. He may have been a prophet of exceptional learning, a master orator, and even a faith healer. Jesus may have even been God in the flesh, but the facts of his life and death have not been accurately recorded for posterity, and the account popular today received through the filter of the four Gospels was deliberately manufactured, as will be shown, c. 144 and 160 AD. Jerusalem has enjoyed an unbroken occupation of Jews, Christians, Arabs, Romans, Crusaders, and many others since 33 AD, but alarmingly the places that Christianity should have never lost are not to be found. Places where there should be located shrines simply do not exist. Where is the birthplace of Jesus? Where is his home in Galilee? Where was Mary's home? Where was the Last Supper conducted? Where was Golgotha, where the crucifix took place, and where is the empty tomb? Where were the places where Jesus was seen and talked with after he was crucified and arisen? These places should have been immortalized. Where was the place Jesus ascended into heaven in the presence of about 500 people? Even the place where Enoch the prophet vanished, Akuzan, Giza, is known even 40 years after at 33 AD. The problem is deeper than this. Not only are these places unknown today, but even the earliest Christian writings make no mention of the location of these sites, nor their preservation. In fact, it was as late as 326 AD that an excavated tomb was suddenly declared to be that of Jesus. 1. John, Matthew, 2. Luke, Isaiah, 3. The Archco volume, 4. The Bible fraud, 5. Christ, the power and the passion, 6. The spear of destiny, 7. The evolution of the idea of God, 8. Jesus, God, man or myth, 10. The decline of the West, 11. Matthew, 12. Tacitus, Annals, 13. The Christ conspiracy, 14. The history of the Christian religion to the year 200, 15. Jesus goes to Hollywood, 24. The lost books of the Bible, 27. The golden treasury of patristic sayings, 28. Augustine, City of God, Book 3, 29. Evolution of the idea of God, 32. Aryan sun myths, citing Diogenes, 35. Fountainhead of all religions, 49. The lost language of symbolism, 50. Mysticism, 51. The gospel truth, 57. The Bible fraud. 34 AD, 3928 AM. The core teachings of Christianity have much in common with Buddhist concepts, which, as we have seen, were already popular in Lower Syria. Interestingly, this year of 34 AD was precisely 576 years, a major golden proportion number, after the start of the Buddhist calendar in 543 BC. 576 is 144 times 4, and this year was also 1440 years after Israel became a nation occupying this same land in 1407 BC. Spengler notes, quote, Christianity is the one religion in the history of the world in which the fate of a man of the immediate present has become the emblem and the central point of the whole creation, unquote. This is indeed the difference between all those gods reviewed under 33 AD, who are parallel to the gospel story of Jesus. Attis, Horus, Dionysus, Quetzalcoatl, and the others were all saviours of the ancient past. Not one single documented historical account can be found about any of them. Not the case with Jesus, a man that has generated so much controversy that entire movements were created throughout history to erase his existence in the historical record, as others strove to prove he existed. Christianity emerged simultaneously in all the major population centres of the Mediterranean basin. Antioch in Syria, Alexandria, Egypt, Thessalonica, Cyrene, Byzantium, and even Rome. The highways of this faith were the sea. Though partly Jewish in origin, it was a faith strong in Galilee, but from its earliest days it is evident that Christianity was a universal and international religion. This new faith was born in antiquity and became the new mould by which men perceived and worshipped their Maker. Peter began his letter to the exiles, quote, "To the exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia and Bithynia," unquote. This is a list of those countries all occupied by the descendants of Israelites, who, as we have seen already, thoroughly documented throughout Chronicon, were by this time well settled and even in communication with one another. These were the lost sheep of the house of Israel spoken about by Jesus, who declared that his message was for them. Peter did not minister to the Jews whose dispersion, the diaspora, had not yet occurred and would not transpire until 70 AD, and then again and finally in 135 AD with the total destruction of Jerusalem and Judea by the Romans. The New Testament records reveal that the apostles were sent out to, quote, "all the cities of Israel," unquote, to the lost sheep. Revealingly, we learn where the descendants of Israel dwelt by the destinations the apostles reached. Eusebius wrote that Thomas went to Parthia, Iraq, Iran, and this is remarkably supported by the traditions of the Syrian Christians of Malabar, India, who claimed that Thomas founded their own church. The story of Jesus appears to have reached India and Tibet early on, calling him by the name Issa, which is close to the Hebrew Yeshua, Joshua. The accounts are many, but one startling series of facts emerge from these Eastern traditions. They claim John the Baptist is not mentioned, that Pilate feared that Jesus would start a revolution in Roman-occupied Judea, and he wanted Jesus dead. They claim the Jews were fascinated with Jesus, not wanting to kill him, and most alarmingly they say that Jesus was never resurrected, only that he taught resurrection. They believe Jesus to be the God-man, but that he died. Historians attest that it is believed that the Apostle Thomas made it to India by 52 AD. Eusebius goes on to report that Andrew went to Scythia on the northern Black Sea coast, and that John went to Asia Minor, Ephesus. Peter went to Pontus, Galatia, Bithynia, Cappadocia, and southern Black Sea coast, where Paul was from. Peter also went to Asia Minor and visited dispersed Jews. Paul travelled to Jerusalem, to Hungary and Illyricum, Balkans. As will be shown, Paul may have travelled far more extensively than this. The study of early Christianity in Chronicon has only just begun. As the 1st century AD is reviewed, more and more light shall be shed on this most fascinating beginning. But from our present vantage point up to 34 AD, it is obvious that the scattered Israelite descendants were unifying under the banner of a new faith with ancient roots that span back to their earliest beliefs as Israelites. Christianity is but a filter by which God continued to fulfill his promises to the seed of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and all those who are adopted into the faith. That a literal man resurrected and ascended has no bearing on the ideal and its acceptance by the faithful. In dealing with future past phenomena, what happened is just as real to us as what could have happened, and God does not damn the soul for so petty an offence as doubt, especially in light of fact that the evidence is wanting. This year was 1480 years after the exodus of Israel in 1447 BC, from Egypt and Moses at Sinai, receiving the law from God. Bonnie Gaunt, Gatria specialist, notes that from the Passover of the Angel of Death in 1447 BC to the Passover when Jesus was crucified was 1480 years. She, like so many others, ends this timeline at 33 AD, when actually the 1480 years ends in 34 AD. Intriguingly, she demonstrates that the Greek title Christ, Anointed One, equals 1480. 1. The decline of the West. 2. The evolution of the idea of God. 3. History and quotations. 4. The lost years of Jesus. 6. The stones and the scarlet thread. 35 AD, 3929 AM. Traditional Christian date when Pontius Pilate was cited before the Roman Senate and then condemned by Caesar for the illegal crucifixion of Jesus. 37 AD. Tiberius Caesar is sick and old but recovering in bed. He is smothered to death in his 78th year. Tiberius is succeeded by Caligula, who was initially very popular with the people. He suffered a coma and emerged to find the Senate opposed to him. Caligula was the great-grandson of Mark Antony. His closest lifelong friend was the Jewish potentate Julius Agrippa, who became his chief ally against the Senate of Rome. The Jewish influence over Roman affairs of state was a source of much animosity against the Jewish people. Caligula immediately began eliminating his political rivals. Suetonius wrote that Caligula was of the habit of saying, when he was having someone executed, quote, "Make him feel that he is dying," unquote. 1. Tacitus, Annals VI. 2. The Lost Treasure of King Juba. 3. History in Quotations. 38 AD, 3932 AM. Roman Emperor Caligula removed the gigantic obelisk from the Egyptian city of Memphis, known anciently as Heliopolis and On Anu, the obelisk being one erected by Thutmose III using Israelite labour. He removed the immense obelisk to the circus area of Rome, a feat of tremendous naval engineering 1554 years after it was erected. The obelisk is a symbol of Israelite heritage and Iron Empire status. Rome in the prophetic records is the Iron Empire, one of slavery and oppression like Egypt of old. At this time in history, no other civilization in the world had enslaved so many people. This obelisk was the twin to another that would be removed, and both obelisks erected by the Israelites in 1515 BC would one day be removed again and erected in the capital commercial cities of Manasseh and Ephraim, patriarchs of the empires of adoption, in London and New York. The obelisk measured 1584 inches high, and in 1586 AD, Pope Sixtus V would remove this one from the circus to the court square of St. Peter's Cathedral. Altogether there were 4 obelisks raised by Thutmose III. The prophetic empires of the descendants of Israel, Manasseh and Ephraim are Britain and the United States, which will be shown abundantly as this chronology progresses. Interestingly, it is no coincidence that Christianity was brought into Britain in this year, according to British historian Gildas, who asserts that it was brought into Britain within a year of Tiberius' death. Further, the word came by way of Jerusalem, not Rome, as at this early date Rome had not yet exerted its authority over the Church. Eusebius wrote that some of Jesus' own disciples visited the British Isles. It is to be recalled that in 585 BC, Jeremiah escorted a royal Judahite princess named Tamar to Ireland by way of Egypt with his friend and scribe Baruch, a visit well remembered in the Irish annals. This year of the arrival of Christianity into Britain was 622 years after the fall of Judah, a number seen over and over in Abrahamic and Israelite histories. 1. St. Paul in Britain. 2. Freemasonry and its ancient mystic rites. 39 AD, 3933 AM. Caligula of Rome imprisoned Ptolemy, king of Mauritania, northwest Africa, jealous of his wealth and perfectly administered kingdom, founded by Juba II and Cleopatra Selene. The people of Mauritania revolt and slaughter the Romans in their kingdom, and Ptolemy is executed. This is the modus operandi of Rome, to instigate and prod their allies into retaliating so they can treat them as enemies and take their wealth and sell off the population into the Mediterranean slave market. 1. The Lost Treasure of King Juba. 40 AD, 3934 AM. As pre-planned by Caligula, the Romans invade Mauritania in an effort to steal away their wealth. The kingdom set up by King Juba II was tremendously prosperous. The people of Mauritania know their peril and refuse to give over their wealth to the Romans. When the Romans invaded, they found nothing of worth, for the Mauritanians fled with the famous treasury, the library of Juba II and the gold coffins of Juba II and Cleopatra Selene, while the defence of Mauritania was led by Aidamon. Also in this year, Philo of Alexandria, a wealthy Jew, visited Caligula in Rome, seeking relief for ill-treated Jews in Egypt, but he was unsuccessful. Pomponius Mela drew a map of the continent of Australia, called Antipodes. This was the 792nd year of Rome. 1. The Lost Treasure of King Juba. 2. Jesus, God, Man or Myth. 3. Elder Gods in Antiquity. 41 AD, 3935 AM. Caligula is murdered, and the Praetorian Guard of Rome makes Claudius the emperor, his full name being Tiberius Claudius Drusus Nero Germanicus. He is the first emperor of the legions, his wife Messina the source of court intrigues and unrestrained sexual activities. Messina once had sexual intercourse with 25 men in a 24-hour period, to beat the record of a lowly servant girl that had excited her jealousy. In Mauritania, the resistance against Rome is led by Aedemon, who successfully defend themselves but cannot drive off the Romans. The Mauritanians were descendants of Phoenicians and Hebrews, Jews, Celtiberians, and Syrians. Many in Mauritania at this early date were Christians led by Alexander Helios, the last of Cleopatra the Great's children. Acquiring the help of local black Africans, the fleeing Mauritanians built a fleet of ships and sailed to North America. Because of storms on the Atlantic during their passing, some ships landed in Central America and South America. The plan was executed perfectly, the Atlantic crossing planned long in advance, the Mauritanians knowing of the greed of Rome. The majority of them, some 10,000 people, travelled up the Mississippi River from the Gulf of Mexico, the Ohio River, and ultimately the Embarrass River in what is now southern Illinois. In the year 1447 BC, 2448 AM, the Israelites fled the oppression of Egypt led by Moses into a new land. In this year of 41 AD, the Mauritanian descendants of Israelites fled the oppression of Rome into a new land led by Alexander Helios, a Macedonian descendant. This being exactly 1447 years after Israel conquered the land of promise in Canaan in 1407 BC. Among the Mauritanians in this exodus to North America were many Christians, a fact borne out by the discovery in 1982 AD of relics from the lost treasury of King Juba II, which depict profiles of Jesus and a picture of Jesus resurrected, with holes in his wrists, not hands. This was 8 years after the crucifixion event in 33 AD, which means that some of those who crossed the Atlantic in this year just may have witnessed the crucifixion or had known and met the apostles or Jesus himself. This means that Christian missionaries could have set foot on the American continents within a decade of the crucifixion. For the discovery of the treasure of King Juba II, see 1982 AD. In History of the Church by Eusebius, church father and historian, we read, quote, "In the reign of Claudius, the all-good and gracious providence, which watched over all things, guided Peter the Great, and mighty among the apostles, who because of his virtue was the spokesman for all the others, to Rome." Unquote. Also in Eusebius we read, quote, "Second year of the 205th Olympiad, the Apostle Peter, after he had established the Church of Antioch, is sent to Rome, where he remains as bishop of that city, preaching the gospel for 25 years." Unquote. Suetonius in his Life of Claudius wrote, quote, "Since the Jews continually made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, Claudius expelled them from Rome." Unquote. This is confirmed in the book of Acts 18:2. For when Paul was in the Greek city of Corinth writing the book of Romans, he met Priscilla and Aquila, refugees, quote, "lately come from Italy, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome." Unquote. 1. The Lost Treasure of King Juba. 4. Four Witnesses. 42 AD, 3936 AM. The Mauritanians rebuild the mausoleum of King Juba II in southern Illinois, North America, and bury the treasures and artifacts in subterranean vaults. The amassed relics depicting Phoenicians, Hebrews, Romans, Mauritanians, Jews, Christians, and even black Africans would be discovered entirely by accident by Russell Burroughs in 1982 AD. The Christian scholar Jerome wrote, quote, "Peter, the prince of the apostles, after his episcopate in the church of Antioch, went to Rome in the second year of Claudius, and continued there for 25 years up to the end of his life in the 14th year of Nero." Unquote. 1. The Lost Treasure of King Juba. 2. Four Witnesses. 43 AD, 3937 AM. Emperor Claudius of Rome invades Britain, this being 96 years after Julius Caesar's last attempt in 54 BC. 96 years is 1152 months, or 144 times 8. 47 AD, 3941 AM. Traditional date for when the Christian convert Paul, formerly named Saul of Tarsus, went to Cyprus. He visits Anatolia, Asia Minor, and returns to Antioch with Barnabas in 48 AD. Paul will be fully detailed in this chronology. 48 AD, 3942 AM. The census of Claudius Caesar showed a citizen body of 5,984,072 Roman citizens. This citizenship was highly prized, for it guaranteed against becoming a slave. This was the 800th year of Rome and 792 years after the 10 tribes of Israel were deported into Assyria in 745 BC. Many descendants of those same Israelites now citizens of Rome in Gaul. 1 Tacitus, Annals XI. 51 AD, 3945 AM. After 136 years orbiting the Sun, the Romanid Apocalypse Comet Group enters the inner solar system in a 20-year-long detritus train that begins passing over the ecliptic. At this time during Claudius' consulship with Cornelius Orfitus, according to Pliny, a strange sun appeared in the sky in addition to our own, probably a disintegrating comet brightly reflecting the sun's light. Repeated earthquakes also afflicted Rome, destroying houses and property outside the city. In the war in Britain, the Romans defeated King Caraticus, bringing the British king and his family to Rome. The Celtic king gave a stirring speech to the Romans, and admiring his bravery and truthfulness in his speech, the Romans pardoned him, freeing him and his family to live in a palace in Rome. It is believed that in this year the Apostle Paul witnessed to the Ephesians, this being 601 years after the completion of their famous temple to Diana. The fervour of the Ephesians for their goddess almost resulted in Paul's untimely death. 1 Pliny, Natural History, Universe and the World. 2 Tacitus, Annals XII. 52 AD, 3946 AM. In the Roman war in Britain, the Welsh clan called the Silures defeated the Roman 20th Legion. Paul preached at some time during the rule of the proconsul of Achaia, named Gallio, staying for a year and a half. Gallio's writings have survived, but he does not mention Paul, though Paul's writings claim that he obtained audience with him. This denotes that either Paul was not popular or noteworthy enough to mention at this time, or that Paul was not known by Paul at this time. Possibly this could also mean that Paul is a fiction later created by the Church to put a personality to the many early Christian epistles. 1 Saxons, Vikings and Celts. 2 The Gospel Truth. 53 AD, 3947 AM. Earthquakes afflicted Phrygia in Asia Minor. This was a thoroughly Greek region, and this was the year 828 of the Olympiad calendar. This is the third year of the passing of the Romanid Apocalypse Comet Group. In this year the people of Ilium petitioned Nero to exempt them from the public burden solely on the fact that Rome was descended from Troy. This is the accepted approximate date for the death of Simon Magus, whom the Church Fathers wrote that, like Irenaeus, he was the father of all heretics. Simon Magus studied the Greek philosophers intensely, and his great heresy was his attempt at trying to bridge philosophy with Christianity. Simon was from Samaria, Lower Syria, and his followers at this date contended with early Christianity. Simon taught in allegory and took everywhere with him a former prostitute from Tyre, a Phoenician woman named Helen. In his teaching she stood with him and symbolized, quote, the lost sheep, unquote. The Samaritans were proud of their ancient Israelite pedigree. They were not Judeans and did not claim to be, and they were aware that through Phoenicia the ancient Israelites sailed to the Aegean world as the Ionians and Danaan, later known as the Hellenes. In the Trojan War, the Israelite Danaan of Dan even fought to get back Helen of Sparta. Simon Magus had a greater grasp on history than did his Christian enemies, for he knew that the ancient Hellenes, the Greeks descended from the lost sheep, were descendants of Israelites. Many of Simon's beliefs were Gnostic. He believed that the angels were the creators of the world, and that the angels were mismanaging their creations. The angels designed the world and laid out precepts for men to follow, deceiving them. Clement of Alexandria, referring to the beliefs of Simon Magus, wrote, quote, for righteous actions are not according to nature, but from accident, in the manner that the angels who made the world have laid it down, by such precepts enslaving men." Unquote. This is amazingly in accordance with the archaic Sumerian and Babylonian texts that read that the Anunnaki, the seven kings, created the world. Simon believed that there was a most high God that was more powerful than the angels, and those who belonged to him were free of the dominion of the deceitful angels. This was a tenet of the Gnostics, that the lower gods, the archons, Anunnaki, created the cosmos and skillfully designed the mechanics of the universe to thwart every good work, that righteous people would find their every whim and work in opposition to the natural laws of the world. The early church fathers were not past relaying false information about Simon Magus either. Justin Martyr, also a native of Samaria, wrote that the Romans erected a statue in honour of Simon on Tibur Island near Rome, an account later related by Irenaeus, Eusebius and Tertullian. This account is untrue. In 1574 AD, the statue was excavated and the inscription reads in Latin, Semos Sancus, the title of an ancient Sabine god of oaths. 1. Tacitus, Annals XII. 3. Simon Magus. 54 AD, 3948 AM. A comet, quote, with a terrible glare, unquote, appeared over Rome. 1. Ancient Mysteries. 56 AD, 3950 AM. Lightning struck both the temples of Jupiter and of Minerva in Rome. This was the year Tacitus was born, Roman historian, author of the Annals of Imperial Rome. Tacitus wrote that at this time the beginning of the year was January the 1st, which was in accordance with ancient religious custom. The Apostle Paul is sent to Rome in second year of Nero, according to Jerome, as agreed by Bede, Ivo, Scaliger, among others. He was a Roman citizen who appealed to Rome for unlawful confinement. Born in Tarsus, a city of Cilicia which according to Strabo was the leading city of learning to rival even Alexandria and Athens. On the way to Rome he was shipwrecked. The oldest of all Christian documents preserved in the Bible are the epistles of Paul. He wrote to the, quote, strangers, unquote, in Rome, not to the Romans. His writings were addressed to Hellenes in Ephesus, to Galatia, Colossae, Corinth, to the Thessalonians and Philippians. From Rome did Paul write to Timothy on behalf of himself and the royal family of Britain, Pudens, Linus and Claudia, the son, daughter and son-in-law of King Caradoc of Britain, also called Caractacus. Caradoc was the son of Bran, the Celtic king of Britain. Caradoc led the British forces against the Romans in 32 battles, but was captured by the treachery of Queen Uregwed of the Brigantes, who invited him to stay in her castle. The Romans had venerated Caradoc and freed him in Rome, taking up residence in the Palatium Britannicum, which his granddaughter Claudia Prudentiana converted into Rome's first Christian church. The Apostle Paul was personal friends with the British royal family in Rome. Who Paul really was has been a mystery, for his writings had been rewritten and many false statements given about his apostleship. His birthland Cilicia was founded by Phoenicians on the Black Sea coast. He was probably of Israelite stock. The people of Cilicia were Semitic. Here are some intriguing facts. Paul never mentions any of the four Gospels in his epistles. Paul never quotes anything Jesus ever said in his epistles. Paul does not mention any historical facts about Jesus. No Pilate, Caiaphas, no mention of the Sanhedrin or Herod, Judas or any other person in the Gospel narratives of the Passion. Paul does not mention the trial before Pilate, the scourging, crown of thorns, the sun darkening, only mentioning that Jesus lived during Pilate's reign. Paul wrote nothing of Jesus' bodily resurrection. To Paul, Christ was resurrection in spirit. Paul's epistles never mention any parables of Jesus, any miracles or acts of Jesus. In the writings of Paul there is no Bethlehem, no Nazareth, no virgin birth, no parents of Jesus, no Magi, no John the Baptist, no Judas, no betrayal, no Sermon on the Mount. In fact, Alexander Holub notices that the epistles of Paul bear a resemblance to the Gathas from the Zend Avesta of Persia, beginning with Yasna XXX onward. On the other side of the coin, neither is Paul known to the first Christian chronicler, Justin Martyr of Samaria, who never mentioned him or his epistles. The book of Acts reads that Paul was known to Jews everywhere, but the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus never mentioned him in his exhaustive histories. Philo never mentioned him, and the epistles of Paul are not mentioned anywhere in the book of Acts. It is very telling that the very first historical mention of Paul is with Marcion, a Gnostic. Before 144 AD, Paul's writings are found mentioned nowhere. See 144 AD. Paul's writings are mentioned later by all three of the Apostolic Fathers, Clement, Polycarp, and Ignatius, cited even by Athenagoras. Scholars believe that Paul was a Gnostic and that his epistles were altered for use in the early Christian scriptures as the Church rose to power. As the Church doctored the epistles, they include statements toward the end of chapters and books, like this one in 1 Corinthians. Paul allegedly writing that about 500 people watched Christ ascend into heaven, a statement scholars believed was not in the original text. According to Irenaeus, the Gnostics did not take the resurrection of Jesus literally, but they did believe in the coming of a Messiah. Gnostic belief held that there was a spiritually pure race long ago descended from Seth, and that they assumed this lineage through their faith. The Gnostics, the Brahmins of India, and the Persians of the Zoroastrian faith held many things in common. In Lower Syria, these Gnostics were also akin to the Nazarenes, Manaeans, the Essenes, and the Therapeutans, all these being branches of the same tree that became Christianity, with a trunk planted in Samaria and roots extending into remote antiquity. By Eusebius's account, the Therapeutans were Christians, a people who strived to assemble the pieces of a pure belief system from the ancient world, by employing teachings from almost all religions and philosophical systems. The Gnostic beliefs and writings seem to stem from multiple sources, an amalgamation taken from Old Persian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Syrian, and Greek beliefs. The links to archaic Judaism are unmistakable, and by extension this means that Gnosticism has roots to ancient Israelite institutions. The Israelites were deported into Babylonia via the Assyrian deportations. Then the Babylonians deported Judah, even settling many of them in Media and Persia. Through Asia Minor and Phoenicia, the early Greeks and Aegean peoples absorbed wave after wave of Israelite migrations. It was at Egypt where Gnosticism took its known forms, at Alexandria where the scholars and intellectual elite put back together the pieces of the elder faith that had been disseminated and sifted among the nations between 1837 and 1825 BC, when Abraham, Brahma, taught at Memphis and at the Giza complex in Egypt before the surface blocks of the Great Pyramid. As the Alexandrian scholars collected more and more scrolls and texts from the East, the Aegean and Mediterranean worlds, they began seeing the stunning correspondences between all ancient religions. One of the greatest beliefs common to all nations discovered at Alexandria was the faith that a Saviour was going to be born among men who was going to teach the truth. At the beginning of the movement called the Way, later popularized as Christianity, the Gnostics were the main body of these believers. As the early Christian communities recognized Jesus as their Saviour embodied within the flesh of a man, it was his message of resurrection and forgiveness that fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies of the coming of a new covenant. As Gnosticism and its various sects were the first to accept Christianity, we clearly see that it was the descendants of Israelites who accepted the message that Christianity is the revival of original Israelite faith. 1. Tacitus, Annals. 3. St. Paul in Britain. 4. Strabo X1v. 5. Post-captivity names of Israel. 8. The Greek myths. 9. The evolution of the idea of God. 10. The history of the Christian religion to the year 22. 11. The gospel truth. 12. The Christ conspiracy. 16. Jesus, God, man or myth. 21. History of the Christian religion and church to the year 300. 58 AD. 3952 AM. Roman general Suetonius was sent to Britannia to subdue the Welsh. He was a veteran who had led the Romans in a series of victories in the Atlas Mountains of Algeria. In this, the 7th year of the passing of the Roman Apocalypse comet group, as the Roman army destroyed the city of Artazata in Armenia, a divine portent appeared according to Tacitus. Quote, "While the sun shone brightly all around the walls, the area of the city itself was suddenly enveloped in a dark cloud, with unearthly lightning flashes." Unquote. The ruminalis fig tree, situated at the place of assembly, died in this year, being 830 years old, planted 773 BC. Its shoots died and trunk withered, which was thought to be a portent of evil, but then the tree revived and grew fresh roots. The Apostle Paul is confined and placed under guard of Governor Felix of Caesarea. Knowing his confinement was illegal, he had appealed to Rome when originally arrested. 1 Tacitus, Annals XIII. Livy too wrote of the ruminalis tree in early history of Rome. 59 AD, 3953 AM. Nero murdered Agrippina. This is the 8th year of the passing of the Roman Apocalypse comet group. In this year, according to Tacitus, the sun darkened over Rome, and all 14 districts of the city were struck with strange lightning, one woman having been killed by a thunderbolt in her husband's arms. The Romans recorded the passage of a comet, and about the same time a flash of lightning struck and broke the table Nero was eating at, in his mansion at Subluqueum. The famous city of Laodicea was destroyed in an earthquake. 1 Tacitus, Annals XIV. 60 AD, 3954 AM. A comet is recorded by the Romans. In a rich kingdom in northern Britain outside of Roman occupation, Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, died. His queen, Boudicca, ruled and was attacked by the Romans. She was bound, stripped and lashed in front of her 2 daughters as the Roman soldiers raped them, both princesses. The Romans ravaged and sacked the kingdom of the Iceni, turning their lands into a Roman province. Boudicca was a tall, red-haired warrior queen, who after her release rallied her people. The masses joined her, and she marched her army against the Romans in Britain, at the Roman colonial city of Colchester, slaughtering the Romans and their loyalists. A Roman legion sent to aid Colchester was also slaughtered to a man. Roman-occupied and sympathetic London was defeated and burned to the ground, as well as St Albans. The revenge of the Iceni set back the entire Roman colonial program. Tacitus recorded that the Iceni slaughtered 70,000 people in their revenge campaign, but the Romans regrouped, were reinforced from the continent and routed the Iceni, killing Boudicca, resulting in the deaths of 80,000 Celts. The Romans had been reinforced by those Romans trying to defeat the Druids among the Welsh. The Apostle Paul departed Rome and travelled to Spain, converting whole multitudes to Christianity. He purposed to travel further to Britain because he had learned from studies at Phoenicia that some of the children of Israel at the time of the Assyrian captivity, 745-721 BC, had escaped to the Isles of Britain. According to a copy of the Book of Acts found in the Turkish Annals at Constantinople, which has an additional chapter the standard Book of Acts does not have, Paul preached mightily before the tribunes at Rome and then travelled to Britain. Paul sailed from Ostium to Spain, and in Spain at Armorica he found a merchant sailing to Britain who voyaged along the European coast to a port called Raffinus in Britain. But news of his coming had already reached the Isles, and when Paul arrived, great multitudes gathered at the news of his arrival, his name already known to the British for exploits abroad. Paul preached to the throngs of people on the shore, and as he spoke the Holy Spirit fell upon him, and he prophesied to the people concerning the last days. From this date, Christianity spread rapidly over the British Isles. Recall that Paul was a personal friend to the British royal family, to King Caractacus of the Celts who lived in Rome. The calendrics for this year are strong. The Olmec calendar was a Western calendar, this being 3312 years since its inception. or 414 times 8, or 552 times 6. The Anunnaki Nephilim hybrids before the flood oppressed the Sethites and mankind, their reign beginning in 2839 BC, or 2898 years earlier, this being 414 times 7. It is 52 plus 52 years, 104, after the start of the Roman Julian calendar. In 2046 AD, the entire Western world will die, and 60 AD is 2046 years before the death of the rest of this present world at Armageddon in 2106 AD. 1. Ancient Mysteries. 2. The Philosopher and the Druid. 4. Tracing Our Ancestors. Tacitus Annals XIV. 62 AD, 3956 AM. A violent earthquake damages buildings in Pompeii and Herculaneum near Mount Vesuvius in Italy on February the 5th. This is exactly 21,000 months, 1750 years, after Mount Vesuvius buried alive entire cities in Italy in 1687 BC. This is the 11th year of the passing of the Romanid apocalypse comet chain. 1. Great Disasters. 63 AD, 3957 AM. A huge earthquake afflicted parts of Italy, 2 miles from Baia, where landslides buried Roman settlements and elaborate bathhouses was the Greek city of Cumae, where the cave of the Sibyl was located. Lightning struck the gymnasium at Rome, burning it down, melting a bronze statue of Nero into a shapeless mass. 1. The Jesus Papers. 2. Tacitus Annals XV. 64 AD, 3958 AM. In the 13th year of the passing of the Romanid Apocalypse Comet Group, lightning struck a portrait of Nero that stood 120 feet high, the largest painting ever. The portrait was on linen and immediately burnt up in the gardens of Maus, according to Pliny the Elder. In this year the city of Rome burned for 7 days, and many historians claim that Nero was grossly negligent in attempts to put the fire out. Some claimed he set the fires through his agents because he dreamed of rebuilding Rome according to his architectural fancies. Tacitus recorded that Nero sang a hymn of the destruction of Troy as Rome burned. The historians of the day noted that Rome began to burn on September the 19th, the exact date the ancient Gauls burned Rome. This was exactly 148 years, 1776 months, after the capital of Rome burned in 83 BC. The story of Nero playing the fiddle as Rome burned was not in the original accounts, a story that appeared about 1500 AD. In Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published in 1776 AD by Edward Gibbon, we read that there was a very prominent Jewish community in Rome at this time, even possessing a very powerful advocate in the Imperial palace. Nero's wife was Poppaea, quote, a favourite actress of the race of the Jews, unquote. When the city burned and the rumours filtered in to Nero that he was being blamed, his own security was threatened. Immediately, agents of Rome went about through the city, even as the fires continued, saying that a sect of Galileans were those capable of this horrible crime against Rome. This was a reference to the same people who would later be called Christians. Nero had been given a scapegoat, and many historians believe that this scapegoat was offered by his Jewish lover Poppaea, for the Jews were involved in much international strife against their Galilean adversaries. Tacitus boasts anti-Christian sentiments in his writings, so to have any references to early Christians is very interesting. Unfortunately, the writings of Tacitus are lost, the originals, and we have today only those that were later preserved through the pens of those allied to the Church of Rome. This was the 108th year of the Roman Julian calendar. Tacitus wrote that a comet appeared toward the end of the year that was accompanied with an unprecedented display of lightning. He wrote that later the comet was associated with a rash of abnormal birth defects. Emperor Nero panicked at the appearance of the comet. His astrologer Suetonius told him that a change of emperor could happen if he allowed his most prominent subjects to live. With this revelation, Nero began exterminating his political rivals. 1. Pliny, Natural History, Mining and Metallurgy. 2. Tacitus, Annals XV. 3. March of the Titans. 65 AD, 3959 AM. In this, the 14th year of the passing of the Roman apocalypse comet group, an earthquake in Ireland sank an entire region of the coast and hinterland into the sea, according to Giraldus Cambrensis. Nero ordered the death of Seneca, his longtime tutor and advisor from his youth. Seneca's writings survive today. Seneca cut his veins, and his distraught wife chose to die with him, opening her veins as well, but Nero knew she would attempt this and ordered secret agents there to prevent her death, which would only bring about more public ridicule. She was bandaged and saved. Seneca's brother was Lucius Gallio, famous for his appearance in the biblical record of the Acts of the Apostles in 18:12-17, where the Greeks of Achaia had brought Paul before the judgment seat of Gallio, who then sent them all away because Jewish law and religion was not for the Roman arbiter to judge between. Seneca had written that one day the huge land on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean would be revealed, America, and that, quote, many discoveries are reserved for ages yet to come, unquote. 1. The Antediluvian World. 2. Tacitus Annals XV. 3. Lost Cities of Atlantis, Ancient Europe and the Mediterranean. 66 AD, 3960 AM. In the 13th year of Nero, an earthquake struck Knossos and pushed open a tomb, wherein the people found a box containing ancient tablets covered in writing they could not read. These were reported as records of the Trojan War, very doubtful, and these writings were sent to Nero. A comet appeared, some today thinking it was Halley's Comet, but this is wrong. A plague decimated the city of Rome, filling the houses with corpses. In this year began the Jewish war against Roman occupation, starting with riots and then the killing of an entire Roman legion, commanded by General Cestius Gallus. Josephus was one of the generals of the Jewish forces. This war would define the times. It was a tiny strip of country that threatened the balance of Roman power abroad, watched with interest by all those other nations weary of Roman oppression. This was the year 3960 Annus Mundi, since mankind was banished from Eden in 3895 BC, or 792 times 5 years. Also, this was 3168 years since the Vedic calendar began, the Kali Yuga, Black Age, or 792 times 4. Further, the Anno Domini calendar, a retroactive timeline not designed until 526 AD, or 460 years after 66 AD, had this year as 66 AD, 66 years being 792 months. In a fit of rage, Nero kicked his pregnant Jewish wife Poppaea to death, historians writing that her pregnancy was advanced. Though Nero's murder of Poppaea was disgusting to the people, the Roman people equally remembered the wicked and cruel exploits of Poppaea, a woman they despised equally for also being a foreigner. We are informed that Nero, in an act of sorrow, found a boy that looked a lot like Poppaea, had him castrated, and dressed as a woman before marrying him in a formal ceremony. The veracity of this account is unknown. This year was 2880 Anno Pyramid, or 1440 plus 1440. 1. History in quotations. 2. Ancient Mysteries. 3. Tacitus Annals XVI. 67 AD, 3961 AM. Josephus leads a Jewish army against Roman forces and is defeated by Vespasian at Jotapata. He is taken prisoner, his virtues as a writer and historian discovered, and commissioned to write a history of the Jewish people. Josephus, known now as Flavius Josephus, wrote Antiquities of the Jews, The Jewish War, and Against Appian. All three of these major historical works preserved today, though in regarding certain Christian statements, there is evidence that later Christian translators interpolated small passages into his work. This is the traditional date for when the Apostle Peter with his wife Concordia and many others were crucified in Nero's gardens, Peter crucified upside down. It is said that Paul was beheaded at this time at the Aquae Salvae in Rome. 1. Secret Places of the Lion. 68 AD. In the 17th year of the passing of the Romanid Apocalypse Comet Group, An unusual occurrence of geological displacement occurred as recorded by Pliny. An entire Roman estate was completely turned around. It was as if the estate was sitting on a giant underground cone that turned around twisting, setting the estate backward. For many reasons, including murdering his wife, his mother Seneca, and multitudes of other crimes, the Senate declares Nero enemy of the public and condemned him to a slave's death, which meant he was to be whipped before the people until dead. Galba is elected emperor and Nero flees Rome, committing suicide with the aid of a former slave named Epaphroditus. Tacitus wrote that Rome was in uproar with auctions. Quote, "Yet great was the joy to think that men whom Nero had enriched would be as poor as those whom he had robbed." Unquote. With Nero's death, a civil war erupted between the provinces and legions loyal to Galba, Otho, and Vitellius throughout Gaul, the German territories, and Italy. The civil war would not end until 70 AD. This was the 576th year of the Republic of Rome, founded in 509 BC. 576 being 144 times 4, and a major golden proportion number. This was also 408 years to the fall of Rome in 476 AD, or 4896 months, 2448 plus 2448. 1. Pliny, Natural History, Universe and the World. 2. Tacitus, Annals. 3. Tacitus, The Histories. 69 AD, 3963 AM. Roman General Vespasian offered sacrifices at the altar on Mount Carmel, which was said by Tacitus to be quite ancient. This was in Lower Syria, a famous site in the Old Testament narratives. The local priest prophesied that Vespasian was destined for greatness, and astrologers confirmed this by noting strange omens appearing in the heavens. This was the 18th year of the Romanid group. In this same year, Vespasian became emperor of Rome and appoints his son Titus to lead the Roman legions against Jerusalem to put down the Jewish war. 1. Tacitus, The Histories, Book II. 70 AD, 3964 AM. According to Josephus in the Jewish War, quote, "There appeared a star resembling a sword, which stood over the city, Jerusalem, and a comet that continued a whole year." Unquote. While the entire Mediterranean world was under Roman dominion, across much of Europe, Asia, and Africa, only Jerusalem revolted, a tiny nation hinged between three continents. The hostility of the Jews alarmed the Romans, and the political ramifications of this war were far-reaching, for a victory by such an insignificant nation would quickly initiate revolts in other areas. Vespasian with his 3 legions had invaded Judea and besieged Jerusalem. But now in 70 AD, Titus appeared with his 10th legion and broke through the city's walls. Tacitus wrote that Jerusalem was a famous city of antiquity, whose people originated in Egypt long ago but had left due to a plague. Tacitus also recorded that it was a widespread belief of antiquarians that the Israelites were mentioned in Homer's epic Iliad as the Solmi, their city of Jerusalem called Hierosolimi, Jerusalem. On the day of Pentecost, just before the fall of Jerusalem, as the priests in the temple precinct were seeing to their duties, a trembling occurred and shook the temple with a great noise, and the people in and around the temple were terrified at hearing a mighty multitude of voices in the air that said, quote, "Let us remove hence." Unquote. As the battle raged for the walls of Jerusalem, many people witnessed what appeared to be armies fighting in the sky over the city with fiery weapons as the temple was illuminated with a strange light, according to Josephus. Interestingly, Tacitus supports Josephus' own account in writing that the temple doors were thrust open and a mighty voice declared a departure. Some reported the air around them mysteriously stirred. The fall of Jerusalem and the emergence of Vespasian and Titus, according to Tacitus, were found in the prophetic books of the temple. Josephus reports that 1 million Jews died defending against Rome in the Jewish war, or were executed afterwards, and that 97,000 Jews were captured and sold into slavery. The fields were salted just as the Romans had done to Carthage in 146 BC. The Christians of Jerusalem and surrounding land were the only ones to escape the Romans, for they heeded the warnings of Jesus uttered in Matthew 24 concerning the destruction of the temple after Jerusalem was encompassed with armies. Jesus had instructed the people to flee to the hills, and the Christian population did in fact flee to Pella, a city east of Jordan, and Petra. Jesus had said, quote, "For the days shall come upon thee, that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee, and they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation." Unquote. The last words here reveal that this destruction was a judgment specifically due to the Jewish denial of Jesus. E. G. White said it best when she wrote that the great sin of the Jews was their rejection of Christ, and the great sin of the Christians was their rejection of the law, books of Moses. All men who fought defending Jerusalem were executed, crucified, and those surviving this were sent in chains to arena garrisons throughout the Roman Empire to die violently in colosseums by the jaws and claws of vicious animals, or in gladiatorial combat matched, where they died at the hands of armoured gladiators, for the enjoyment of the crowds. Jerusalem was torn down with the temple and its districts burnt. Roman architects laid waste the city and rebuilt it, as a Roman city named Aelia Capitolina. Rome began minting special coins with the caption "Judea conquered." These coins have been discovered, showing a sorrowful figure representing Judea. Titus had the temple emptied, taking the valuable temple relics and artefacts recast since 537 BC. Among the treasures of the temple acquired by Titus was a copy of the ancient Book of the Upright, known today as the Book of Jasher. This amazing chronological history of the world is available today by Book Tree Press in San Diego. The true Book of Jasher, not to be confused with its forgeries which gave it a bad name among academics. The temple relics are taken to Rome, where the Romans built a huge architectural complex in commemoration of the fall of Jerusalem, with reliefs of the siege and of the artefacts taken from Jerusalem. This is located upon the Arch of Titus. Oswald Spengler, in his Decline of the West, quote, "The destruction of Jerusalem hits only a very small part of the nation, one, moreover, that was spiritually and politically by far the least important. It is not true that the Jewish people have lived in the dispersion since that day, for it had lived for centuries, in a form which was independent of country." Unquote. This was indeed true, for there were very populated Jewish centres at Alexandria and in Persia. They were ruled not by kings or high priests, but by ethnarchs and exilarchs. The calendrics for this year are telling. In the year 713 BC, Jerusalem was surrounded by the Assyrian army of Sennacherib and miraculously delivered, this being 3182 Annus Mundi. Now Roman armies surround Jerusalem in 70 AD, which is 3182 of the Mayan calendar. Further, in 723 BC, the Assyrians again besieged Israel, this being Samaria, the capital, and this siege was exactly 792 years before the Romans defeated Jerusalem. This year was also 1480 years after the Israelites conquered Lower Syria in 1411 BC, occupying the lands formerly belonging to Og of Bashan and Sihon of the Amorites. But the greatest calendrical timeline attached to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD is that it was precisely 1,000 years after the civil war between Judah and Israel that resulted in the two kingdoms in 931 BC. This is the 1000th year alluded to in the prophecy of Hosea, c. 931 BC. This ended the first day, which began with the nation being torn. This begins another 1,000 years to the emergence of the descendants of Israel as the European nations we know today, every single one of them by 1070 AD being Christian cultures. The unification of Judah and Israel will not occur until the final 1,000 years is complete, in 2070 AD, known as the Resurrection event. The fall of Judah begins 65 years to the final destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple, which will be rebuilt in the year 135 AD. This is the second fulfillment of a prophecy uttered by Isaiah, made in 810 BC. Isaiah predicted to the king of Judah that Ephraim, Israel, will be broken in 65 years, indicating the year 745 BC, when the Assyrians carried them away into captivity. Now, this same 65 years is repeated for Judah. 70 AD is 65 years before the fateful date of 135 AD. Interestingly, the news of the burning of Rome reached the Druids in this year, the Druids proclaiming that this was a sign from heaven indicating the coming fall of Rome and, quote, portended universal empire for the Transalpine nations, unquote. The Transalpine nations were all descended from the deported Israelites. 1. Josephus, The Jewish War. 2. Tacitus, The Histories. 5. Luke. 6. Planet in Rebellion. 7. The Jesus Papers. 9. Decline of the West. 10. Hosea. 73 AD, 3967 AM. The last stronghold of the Zealots, 960 men, commit suicide. The Romans besieged their stronghold, and at Passover, rather than suffering their women to be raped and sold into slavery with their children and themselves dying by execution and crucifixion, the entire Zealot community in Judea committed suicide. 1. The Jesus Papers. 76 AD, 3970 AM. In this year the Saka calendar of India begins, the Saka being the eastern designation for the house of Isaac, Beth Sak, that populated and overlorded the lands of Persia and eastward into northern India. This calendar marked the beginning of the Saka dynasty of India, connected in time to the beginning of the Israelite dynasty of the Danaan over Mycenae in 1255 BC, which began 1332 years before 76 AD. This year was the 660th since the fall of Judah in 585 BC. This year marked the end of the 8th Mayan Baktun of 144,000 days, since the start of the Mayan long count in 3113 BC, this being 1,152,000 days completed, or 144,000 times 8. Under the original 360-day year system prior to 713 BC, the Baktuns were exactly 400 years, but with the alteration of the year to 365.25 days, the Baktuns were now 394.5 years, 144,000 days. Additionally, the dark satellite passed through the inner solar system, close to Earth on its 395-year orbit. Pliny relates that a bright object was seen like a javelin in the sky over Italy, seen by Titus. It was regarded as an omen of doom. This year was the 828th year of Rome, this being 414 plus 414 years, a calendrical system having its origin with phoenix orbits of 138 years each. This year began a 476 year, fall of Rome in 476 AD, countdown to the year 552 AD. The phoenix cycle is 552 years, when the European Huns would invade India. 1. Pliny, Natural History, Universe and the World. 79 AD, 3973 AM. Mount Vesuvius in Italy erupts violently, and the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum are buried in pumice and ash. Thousands and thousands of people suffocated and buried alive. Later all of this would harden and become a newer surface. These were Roman luxury resort cities with retreats, expansive baths, spas, pools and brothels. Archaeologists have excavated beautiful frescoes on the walls of buried structures that exhibit lithe and beautiful women wearing modern-style bikinis, some women with blonde hair. Other artistic depictions are sexually explicit of lewd acts or posing in provocative postures. These people who were buried alive had no idea that their own cities were built upon a former civilization that had also met the same fate, volcanic burial in 1687 BC. The famous historian Pliny the Elder sailed toward the destruction when he received word that a female friend of his had called for his assistance on getting out of the area. Pliny died in the attempt. His renowned book Natural History is internationally esteemed. His source materials including 147 Roman and 327 foreign authors of other works he cites. Throughout his writing he refers back to Trojan times, admitting the origin of the Roman people. Pliny wrote in Natural History that the world experiences, quote, ominous and long drawn-out eclipses of the sun, unquote, and that, quote, their cause was hidden by the rarity of their occurrence,
and for this reason they are not understood, unquote. He wrote that these strange darkenings of the sun were quite natural, and that they transpire at fixed times. Pliny here was referring to planet Phoenix, his source materials no doubt dating back through history to times when there was a more accurate knowledge of the phenomenon. 1. Lost cities of Atlantis, ancient Europe and the Mediterranean. 2. Secret cities of old South America. 3. The antediluvian world. 4. Pliny Natural History, Universe and the World. 81 AD, 3975 AM. The Colosseum in Rome is finished, a marvel of architectural engineering. During the celebration of its opening, 5,000 animals died in a single day, pitted against each other, against armed slaves and against gladiators. Countless many people would meet horrific fates in this colossal structure for the next few centuries, all for the entertainment of the Roman people. Much of the Colosseum still stands today over 1930 years later. 86 AD, 3980 AM. By this date the British had fought the invading Romans in 60 major battles, and still Rome had not subdued as much of Britain as they wanted. No nation had ever withstood Rome so mightily. 94 AD, 3988 AM. Flavius Josephus completed his celebrated Antiquities of the Jews, a true mine of antiquarian knowledge. 1. History of the Christian religion to the year 200. 96 AD, 3990 AM. This is the date of historians for the composition of the Apocalypse, called also the Book of Revelation. In this year the Christian oppressor Emperor Domitian died, a peace beginning for the Christians. Ignatius and his church survived. John was exiled upon the Isle of Patmos, and upon being freed he returned to Ephesus until his death, he being about 87 years old at this time. The revelation was a direct message to the seven churches: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, all Greek cities in Asia Minor, the same region that was thickly populated with and exported waves of people descended from Israel, Danaan, Ionians and Gauls. Justin Martyr, about 140 AD, claimed that Revelation was written by John, but almost all chroniclers afterward disbelieved this. About 250 AD, Dionysius was head of the Alexandrian school, and once Bishop of Alexandria. He was also the pupil of the scholar Origen, and he wrote that John did not write the Apocalypse at all, claiming that the material was from one named Cerinthus, founder of the Corinthians. Dionysius said that the author of the Apocalypse was not the same man as that who wrote the Gospel of John or the Epistles of John. Cerinthius lived at Ephesus in 96 AD and taught at the same time as John the Apostle. According to Irenaeus, writing about 170 AD, Cerinthus taught that the world was created by a power subordinate to God. Epiphanius claimed at about 380 AD that it was the belief of Cerinthus that the world was created by the angels. This made Cerinthus a Gnostic. As seen earlier, this was also the belief of Simon Magus, and as related in 4039 BC, this is exactly what we find: the renovation of a ruined earth by the hands of angelic beings called Anunnaki. Cerinthus was very specific in making a distinction between original Judaism and the latter faith of the Jews that was filled with corruption. Many historians are in agreement that the Apocalypse is a Gnostic text. It is an amalgamation of writings from older texts of Phrygia, Egypt, the Hebrews, and Greece. The Eastern churches knew that the Apocalypse was compiled from much older texts. Pike wrote that it belongs to extreme antiquity. Quote, "It reproduces what is far older than itself." Unquote. Its ancientness is shown in that it makes the year to be 360 days, not 365. This means that it dates at least to 713 BC, but it is no doubt much older. It is very possible that a lost writing of John was used to prefix the actual Apocalypse account, which itself derived from very ancient prophetic manuscripts. Revelation is probably a Christianized version of the last days, drawn from the lost Hebrew prophetic works, the books of the Sibyl and the Greek prophecies burned in 1 AD. As shown in Lost Scriptures of Giza, the Revelation text reproduces over 70 points priorly found in the pre-Christian Book of Enoch, sometimes word for word. The subject matter of the Apocalypse concerns three major events that will occur in the last days that will affect the entire world. These are the sixth seal of the Apocalypse, shown in When the Sun Darkens, and Nostradamus and the Planets of Apocalypse, to be the return of planet Phoenix, that will cause a pole shift that will literally kill a fourth of the world's population and alter the geographical boundaries of nations as the seas and oceans overextend their coasts. Also depicted is the alteration of the Earth's orbit, changing the motion of our planet, altering the length of the day and length of the year, altering our calendar. This is fully described in Anunnaki Homeworld as the Passover of planet Nibiru. These two intruder planets will cause these global disasters in 2040 and 2046 AD. This third message of the Apocalypse is the coming of God to Earth to engage the enemy, to defeat the Anunnaki seven kings who created the present world in 2106 AD, the subject of Descent of the Seven Kings. Lastly, the year 96 AD is very significant. In this year the Anunnaki planet Nibiru reached aphelion, the farthest distance from the Earth and Sun. It travelled away from the inner solar system for 366 years, and now begins its 366-year journey back. Additionally, 96 AD is precisely 1944 years after God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, and the Elamite cities of the Harappan Valley in 1849 BC. Counting this same 1944 years after 96 AD is the year 2040 AD, when planet Phoenix will destroy a quarter of the world's population and plunge surviving humanity back into the Neolithic Age. For these reasons, the authorship of the Apocalypse is unimportant. The old document is still of profound prophetic value. 1. Four witnesses. 3. The secret teachings of all ages. 4. The Christ conspiracy. 5. History of the Christian religion and church to the year 300. 9. The gospel truth. 108 AD, 4002 AM. This is the 33rd pass of planet Phoenix through the inner solar system since the destruction of the pre-Adamic world in 4309 BC. There are not records of any kind of astronomical sighting in this year. This is 690 years, orbits of Earth around the Sun, since Phoenix transited between Earth and the Sun in 583 BC. By this date, the science of the Phoenix has been completely lost. This, as the year 108 AD is exactly 1998 years, 666 times 3, before Armageddon. Remarkably, this is 1554 years after the exodus of Israel from Egypt, and in the year 1554 AD, Nostradamus the prophet, a French scholar and doctor of Jewish lineage, finished his Centuries, a mysterious coded prophetic text that has much information about the return of Phoenix in the year 2040 AD, a date specifically targeted by Nostradamus himself. See Nostradamus and the Planets of Apocalypse. 111 AD, 4005 AM. Pliny the Younger was the nephew of the famous Pliny the Elder, author of Natural History, who died trying to save a friend from the disaster of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. At this time, Pliny the Younger was the governor of Asia Minor, and he wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan asking how he should treat the Christians. He claimed that the Christians, quote, sings hymns to Christ as to God, unquote. Note here that his jurisdiction was Asia Minor. 1. Christ, the Power and the Passion. 115 AD, 4009 AM. Alexandria, Egypt, boasted of a thick Jewish population, much of which was resented by the Greeks and Egyptians as well as others, many having grown rich as tax collectors and enforcers under the Ptolemies. A Jewish leader named Lucullus leads a revolt in protest of the Roman occupation of Palestine, but the uprising is put down violently. Lucullus claimed to be a messiah. The prosperous Jewish community is crushed by the Romans. An earthquake occurs late in the year in Syria, and the Christians are officially blamed for the disaster. Ignatius, the Christian bishop of Antioch, Syria, a prolific writer, was cited to Rome and condemned by Emperor Trajan to be fed to the wild beasts in the Colosseum. Ignatius wrote a letter to the Ephesians saying that at the appearance of Christ, unquote, all the power of magic became dissolved, and every bond of wickedness was destroyed. Men's ignorance was taken away, and the old kingdom was abolished, God himself appearing in the form of a man, for the renewal of eternal life, unquote. This apocryphal document demonstrates even the early belief of Christians that Jesus was God in the flesh. The document, if authentic, would have been written about 75 years after the crucifixion. 1. Christ, the Power and the Passion. 2. History of the Christian religion to the year 200. 3. Ignatius' letter to the Ephesians. 116 AD, 4010 AM. The extermination of the Jews in Alexandria, Egypt, is completed, though many escaped. Lucullus had proclaimed himself king of the Jews, but was killed and the Jewish community destroyed. Emperor Trajan, exasperated by the Jewish uprising spreading throughout the provinces, orders that all Jews in Mesopotamia be killed. He blames them specifically for all of the civil unrest. Trajan invades Mesopotamia and defeats the Parthians all the way up to the Persian Gulf. Christians are viewed as little different than Jews at this time and are rounded up and executed as well. This is the year 868 after the founding of Rome in 753 BC, or two judged time periods of 434 years each, detailed in Stephen Jones's book Secrets of Time. This is also 828 years after the Assyrians under Sennacherib in 713 BC surrounded Jerusalem and carried many people off into captivity into Mesopotamia, though Jerusalem was spared. This was also the 700th year after the fall of Judah in 585 BC, and 160 years of the Roman Julian calendar. Lastly, this was the 40th year since the beginning of the Saka calendar of India. This was an evil time for both Jews and Christians. 1. The Jesus Papers, 2. March of the Titans. 117 AD, 4011 AM. Hadrian becomes Emperor of Rome. He was born in 76 AD, reigning until 138 AD. 120 AD, 4014 AM. Rome annexes Britain by treaty, but even at this late date the Romans cannot conquer all of Britain. Hadrian orders the building of a wall, which is built 78 miles across and 16 feet high, across the strip of land joining Scotland and Britain to keep out the violent and barbaric people of the north. Britain was thickly populated with the descendants of the Israelites, and the calendrics between Rome and Britain are very telling. This year was 1506 years after 1387 BC, when ancient Italia invaded Old Britain, the sum of 1506 being 753 plus 753. 753 BC Rome founded. This was also 1530 years after 1411 BC, when the Israelites conquered Lower Syria and settled in, 153 being a number early on associated with Christianity, and being the number for sons of God in Gatria and Jewish Kabbalic system. Further, 120 AD was exactly 864 years after the Israelites were deported into Assyria in 745 BC, and 432 years, half of 864, after the start of the Syrian-Greek Seleucid calendar in 313 BC. This year of Rome's annexation and invasion of Britain was 840 years after the last of the 10 tribes were deported in 721 BC, and this was the 1000th year since the building of the Israelite capital city Samaria in 881 BC. 125 AD, 4019 AM. Saturnius wrote that the world and all things in it were created by 7 angels, all subservient to the Father. Even as early as this date, the Christians were at odds with one another over many Gnostic tenets such as this one. Official Roman Christianity would soon completely wipe this belief out. Though humanity's origin and the creation of the world by 7 angelic beings, Anunnaki, dates back many thousands of years. 1. History of the Christian religion to the year 200. 132 AD, 4026 AM. Exactly 66 years, 792 months, after the start of the Jewish War in 66 AD,
Simeon bar Koshba, the name means son of a star, led a rebellion in Judea against Rome. Again, Judea sent shockwaves throughout the far-reaching Roman Empire and threatened Roman stability. As Roman occupation forces and agents kept in check their vast holdings in northern Africa, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, Illyricum, Italy, Sicily, Spain, Gaul, and the German frontiers to the Rhine, as well as much of Britain, the tiny Jewish state again exhibited fortitude and a significant military threat. Unlike other nations, the Jews were able to repopulate their little nation after the total destruction of Judea and Jerusalem in the earlier Jewish war, because more Jews lived abroad among other nations in Jewish communities than could ever live in the small geographical confines of Palestine. Also in this year, Zhang Heng of China invented the first earthquake sensor, a seismograph. This incredible device was about 8 foot high, with 8 bronze dragons holding metal balls in their jaws. The device had an internal pendulum connected to the dragon's tails, like levers, and when an earthquake occurred, the pendulum would pull and make a dragon drop its ball into a frog's mouth, indicating the direction of the quake. 1. Technology of the Gods. 133 AD, 4027 AM. Hadrian led the invasion of Galilee and then Judea, his second in command being Julius Severus, governor of Britain. The Romans invaded with 60,000 to 80,000 troops, about 9 to 12 legions. The Jewish defenders fought a guerrilla war that taxed the Romans. The war would continue throughout this and the next year. 1. The Jesus Papers. 135 AD, 4029 AM. The Jewish war through 133–135 AD was an embarrassment to Rome. Emperor Hadrian's losses of Roman citizen soldiers and foreign auxiliaries was astounding. The actual death toll censored after the war in the same fashion modern governments censor casualty rates and death tolls during unpopular wars. At the start of the war, Julius Severus was in Britain, but he was summoned to the Jewish war, and after conscripting more troops with the promises of Roman citizenship, the armies of Rome, according to Cassius Dio, completely destroyed 50 of the most important Jewish strongholds, 985 villages and towns killed in battle, 585,000 men of the Judaic province in raids and battles, though the death toll far exceeded this, due to the ensuing famine, fires and disease. Cassius Dio asserts that the whole of Judea was laid waste, for it was an embarrassment to the Roman government that such an insignificant people could have threatened the security of so powerful and widespread an empire. Hadrian was disgusted with the Jewish people and wanted to forever end their memory. He renamed Judea Palestina, which is the origin of the name Palestine today. After the fall of Jerusalem, the Rabbi Johanan ben Zakkai led Hadrian into the temple site and into a deep catacomb underneath the Temple Mount. Hadrian was shown the bones of skeletons of gigantic humans who had stood over 9 feet high, Zakkai informing Hadrian that these were the Amorite giants that the Hebrews had killed long ago, saying also that it was only by the will of God that Rome overcame Jerusalem, for had the Jews listened to their prophets and served God, then the whole of Rome's greatness would not have sufficed to defeat them. This year is the year 65 since 70 AD, when Jerusalem was priorly destroyed with the temple, the, quote, breaking of Ephraim, unquote, according to Isaiah the prophet. 1. Cassius Dio, circa 205 AD, Roman history. 2. The Jesus Papers. 3. Buber's Tanhuma Devarim 7 in Judaism, edited by Arthur Hertzberg. About 265 years later, Augustine of Hippo wrote, quote, "The Jewish nation, condemned for unbelief, is rooted out of its own land and dispersed through every region of the world, that it might carry everywhere the sacred scriptures, and that the testimonies of the prophecies by which Christ and the Church were foretold might be furnished by our adversaries, so that it could not be thought that these predictions had been forged by us." Unquote. Letters to Marcellinus cited in the Golden Treasury of Patristic Sayings. 139 AD, 4033 AM. Roman-occupied Egypt celebrated the Sothic festival,
believing they were commemorating the passage of the sacred 1460 years. The chronologists by this date were in error, for this date corresponds with absolutely nothing. 1 End of Eden. 140 AD, 4034 AM. Ptolemy published his Almagest, a model of a geocentric solar system that accurately predicts the movements of the planets. 1 Human accomplishment. 144 AD, 4038 AM. In this year, Marcion published the first version of the New Testament on record. Marcion was 48 years old, born 96 AD, a man of Pontus, his father a bishop of that church, according to Epiphanius. He was a well-educated man, and some believed him to have been the son of a Briton. That Marcion Marcellus was actually a Druid at Tongres, who influenced the development of the Celtic Church. Some held that he was a Gnostic named Mark, who taught at the Christian Church at Jerusalem. Whatever the case, in this year Marcion brought forth to Rome his New Testament books, written in the Greek language. However, we are told that his Gospel was originally written in Samaritan, and that it was rabbinical. His New Testament consisted of the Gospel and the Apostolicon. Marcion claimed that this Gospel account came from Paul himself, who was a Gnostic. Marcion was a sea captain, and it was probably on his voyages that he became acquainted with Paul's teachings and epistles. Further, his contact with so many different cultures of early Christians is why there are diverse accounts of who he was. He collected 10 of the letters of Paul and published them, but interestingly, Marcion is not aware of any other New Testament writings. The Apostolicon consisted of 10 of Paul's letters as follows: Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, not the 15th and 16th chapters, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, Philippians. These were published in this order. The epistles of Paul to Timothy, Titus, and the book of Hebrews were unknown to Marcion. Further, Marcion did not include the book of Acts, 1st and 2nd Peter, James, Jude, or the Revelation. Additionally, Marcion's Gospel was totally devoid of the fantastic. This Gospel version does not mention anything about the birth of Jesus or his childhood, beginning with Jesus' 30th year, the start of his ministry. This Gospel does not mention any miracles performed by Jesus, no John the Baptist, no Mary Magdalene or Judas Iscariot. There is no crucifixion, resurrection, or ascension to heaven. Scholars assert that there is abundant textual evidence to show that the Gospel account of Marcion was the source material for the Gospel of Luke, Matthew, and Mark. Marcion was different from other Gnostics in that he adhered to a literal interpretation of the Holy Scriptures, while the Gnostics were fond of viewing them as allegory. Even his principles of worship differed from the Gnostics. Marcion saw a difference between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, and he held that Jesus was not the promised Messiah. A follower of Paul, Marcion accused the other apostles of perverting the gospel doctrines. There are historians who believe that Marcion was a member of the Therapeutian Brotherhood. By all accounts, his gospel text originated at Antioch in Syria, the cradle of Christianity. Marcion was considered a Christian even by his adversaries. Remarkably though, he had no adversaries until afterward. His enemies contended with him retrospectively. This literally indicates that the Christianity we know today did not exist in 144 AD, but was manufactured later by men who were later compelled to discredit Marcion. This year is 888 years after the Israelites were deported into Assyria in 745 BC. 1. History of the Christian religion and the Church to the year 300. 2. The Christ conspiracy. 3. The Bible fraud. 8. Jesus, God, man or myth. 150 AD, 4044 AM. Jewish Rabbi Jose wrote that according to his calculation, the Great Flood transpired in what translates into this calendar as 2103 BC. He was 136 years off from 2239 BC, but this is consistent with the 133 disparity between the modern Jewish calendar and the Annus Mundi. About 150 AD, Justin Martyr wrote 2 apologies defending Christianity. He was a great scholar and historian, long regarded as the most influential of the early church fathers. He sought to prove the divinity of Christ, quoting 300 passages from the Old Testament and almost 100 from apocryphal texts of the New Testament. But strikingly, Justin never mentions the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. In his dialogue with Trypho, he attempted to show that Jesus was predicted in the Old Testament, not mentioning any of the four Gospels, though he does cite the apocryphal Gospels of Basilides and Apelles, as well as the memoirs of the Apostles. This was almost 120 years after the crucifixion event in 33 AD, and still there is no historical hint of the existence of these four Gospels. This is the 1080th year of the divided kingdom. 1. The incredible discovery of Noah's Ark. 2. The Christ conspiracy. 3. Jesus, God, man or myth. 161 AD, 4055 AM. A council of Christian leaders at Alexandria assembled and formally pronounced that there was an historical Jesus. Thus the incarnation became formally accepted doctrine. This council would not have been required had it been the general widespread belief that Jesus existed. 1. The Christ conspiracy. 162 AD, 4056 AM. Out of the Far East in China, a plague spreads into the Middle East and quickly into the provinces of Rome. The epidemic will cripple China for 11 years and will afflict the Roman world for 16 years. A dark age begins in China that will last 46 years until 208 AD. Entire provinces of the Roman Empire are depopulated by the plague, and the Goths begin encroaching upon the fringes of the empire, none in the lands to oppose them. On the other side of the world, in the land of Ophir, called Peru today, where there is gold according to the scriptures, the Andean Empire at Cuzco is devastated by earthquakes and the appearance of comets, strange portents and warfare. This occurred in the reign of the 62nd king of Cuzco. The megalithic city is abandoned, and the people go and dwell in the mountain city of Tamputoco, believed by Zechariah Sitchin to be the city of Machu Picchu, where 28 kings would rule until the people returned to Cuzco in 1012 AD. The calendrics for this year are very prominent, linked to the anciently highly regarded great year of 600-year epochs that the very earliest chronographers claimed the history of the world was divided by. This was 600 times 9 years of the Anunnaki chronology, 600 times 7 years of the orbital chronology, when Earth assumed its present orbit around the Sun in 4039 BC, and 600 times 6 years after the descent of the Watchers, Anunnaki, in 3439 BC. This was also 600 times 5 years after the founding of the Anunnaki dynasty, the year of Noah's birth in 2839 BC, as well as 600 times 4 years after the Great Flood in 2239 BC. Further, this was 600 times 3 years after Manasseh and Ephraim in Egypt were adopted into the family of Israel in 1639 BC, and 1200 years, 600 plus 600, after David was born in 1039 BC. This was also the year 2976 Anno Pyramid, and 408 years after the founding of the Parthian dynasty over Mesopotamia in 247 BC, 408 years being 4896 months. This was the year 670 since the founding of the Republic of Rome in 509 BC. 170 AD, 4064 AM. Athenagoras wrote the Book of Angels and Giants. It was accepted history of this time that wicked angels, Anunnaki, long ago before the deluge, copulated with human females, who then gave birth to monstrous giants. Only later was there an official church movement to suppress this history. Also in this year, Roman Emperor Marcus Antonius received a letter from the Bishop of Sardis in Asia Minor, named Melito, requesting the emperor's attention concerning Christians being vexed, informing the emperor that he was a descendant of emperors who had overturned the policies of Nero concerning Christians. Melito also informed him that what was known as Christianity then was actually of very high antiquity,
and was imported into the Roman Empire in the reign of his ancestor Augustus Caesar. 1. Aryan Sun Myths, citing Diogenes. 177 AD, 4071 AM. The New Testament Book of Acts first enters the historical record in 177 AD. In the western frontier of the Roman Empire at Gaul, France, in the area of Lyon, a terrible persecution of Christians emerged, the worst wave of tragedy to occur since Nero's tribulation in Rome over a century before. Mobs had assembled all the believers and spent many days torturing men, women, and even children, while their leader Irenaeus, the bishop, was away travelling. These were the first Gallic martyrs in Christendom. This occurred exactly 144 years after the crucifixion event in 33 AD. That the Gauls were of ancient Israelite stock has been sufficiently demonstrated herein, but the true extent of the Gallic world at this time in history is best found in the words of Rev. H. J. Warner from 1922 AD when he wrote, quote, "In order to understand the situation, political and ecclesiastical, in southern France, we must bear in mind that the Gauls of the west and the Galates of the east were of the same stock, and that each branch, though several nations intervened, retained unimpaired its racial characteristics. Galli, Galatei, Celtae are all but different forms of the same word." Livy would speak of the Gauls of the east, Polybius of Galatians in the west. The Gauls were a warm-hearted people, but unstable in their friendships, impetuous and courageous in war. To these traits may be added vivid imagination, a fondness for song and poetry. Gaul had become one of the perpetual conquests of Rome, and had submitted to its governmental system, but nothing could eradicate its racial peculiarities. The Gaul was an individualist, the Roman an imperialist, and hence the Gaul might be conquered but never destroyed. The Western Gaul had never lost touch with its eastern kin. Its Christianity from the earliest times was on eastern rather than western lines. The letter which the Christians in Gaul in AD 177, describing the sufferings and deaths of the martyrs in the persecution, sent to the brethren in Asia and Phrygia, can only be explained on the assumption that they were the same kith and kin. In fact, one of the martyrs, Alexander, was a Phrygian. Unquote. 1. Simon Magus. 2. Four witnesses. 3. The Albigensian heresy. 178 AD, 4072 AM. The calendrics for this date suggest that something major occurred relative to either or both Rome and the descendants of Israel. This is also an approximate date for the detonation of a supervolcano that erupted in New Zealand. It is believed that this eruption thrust ash as high as 40 miles into the atmosphere, causing cooler temperatures around the world. The date for this explosion varies from 177 to 186 AD. 1. The Science Times Book of Natural Disasters. Apocalypse 2012. 180 AD, 4074 AD. Roman historian Cassius Dio wrote that from the death of Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the Romans had descended from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. This analogy is interesting, for the prophets of the Old Testament foretold of the Romans, specifically describing them as the Iron Empire. Church father and historian Irenaeus of Gaul was the first to mention one of the four Gospels, that of Luke. Irenaeus studied the writings of Polycarp and was his student, Polycarp having been a disciple of the Apostle John, one of Jesus' 12 apostles. Irenaeus referred to the four Gospels as the four pillars. In fact, Irenaeus was one of the three fathers responsible for influencing the introduction of the four Gospels into circulation, with Clement of Alexandria 200 AD and Tertullian of Carthage 200 to 210 AD. Irenaeus being the first to mention the four Gospels, it is curious that Irenaeus was also the first to mention the supremacy of the Church at Rome. The writings of Irenaeus, Clement and Tertullian laid the foundation for the Roman Catholic supremacy. In Rev. Dr. Davidson's book Introduction to the New Testament, 19th century, we read,
There is reason to believe that very soon after the four Gospels appeared, somewhere between the years 180 to 200 AD, they were published under the authority and by the direction of the Church of Rome, in a volume with the Old Testament and with the other New Testament books then in circulation. That the four Gospels cover events at least 150 years prior to any references that they even existed is disturbing. Not one of the four Gospels is mentioned in any other part of the New Testament writings. No manuscripts of the Gospels are in existence dating further back than the 4th century AD, and nor is there any trace that older manuscripts existed. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John are not mentioned by the earliest Christian fathers, Clement of Rome, Ignatius, and Polycarp, nor did Justin Martyr know of any such Gospels. The first epistle written outside the New Testament writings was the Epistle of Clement of Rome, written about 97 AD, in which there is not a hint about the existence of these books. To illustrate how odd this is, take this scenario into consideration. How authoritative would a book be concerning the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865 AD at Ford's Theatre if the book was not released to the public until the year 2015 AD? That would be 150 years. Again, what about a book about the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 963 AD at Dallas if the book would not be released until 2113 AD? Again, that's 150 years. We have the histories of historic men like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar, because their lives were recorded by their contemporaries, and every one of these men lived long before Jesus did. The four Gospels appeared well after the Bar Kokhba rebellion and fall of Jerusalem, 132-135 AD. As this is the earliest date for the Gospel of Luke, we find it further incredible that Luke himself was not even an apostle, nor was Mark an apostle, and John is believed not to be John the Apostle, but John the Presbyter. At this time also wrote Athenagoras, an Athenian philosopher, who had become a Christian, contributing greatly to its literature. He even wrote an apology to Roman emperors Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, defending Christianity. He nowhere mentions any of the four Gospels by name, which is remarkable when considering that he mentions by name Moses, Jeremiah, Jonah, Thales, Plato, Homer, Hesiod, Herodotus, Pythagoras, Euripides, Aristotle, and others. It is believed by scholars that John's Gospel was first mentioned about this year of 180 AD by Theophilus, Bishop of Antioch in Syria. Scholars have made intense studies of the content of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and discovered what the German scholars have termed the Q document, from Quelle, which is German for source. When comparing the texts of Matthew and Luke, they discovered that they only agree when following the text of Mark. This indicates that Mark was used as the source material for Matthew and Luke. Mark does not have any genealogies, no mention of Mary or a virgin birth, no Old Testament messianic prophecies, no resurrection appearances of Jesus, no ascension into heaven. The Mark text is almost entirely duplicated in Matthew, with 606 of the 661 verses appearing word for word in Matthew. Whoever wrote Matthew copied Mark while adding much more material from another source. But many passages in Matthew and Luke are not found in Mark, passages appearing in both Matthew and Luke. This indicates that there was yet another source material, the mysterious Q document. The Q document, source of the Gospel accounts, was evidently written in Greek in the area of Palestine, perhaps Galilee. It did not mention a Messiah or Christ concept, nor was the Judean religion scorned, and there was no death and resurrection that would transform the world. Alexander Holub in the Gospel Truth wrote the Q document was devoid of mythological additions, but had instructions on how to live in troubled times, a writing having developed out of Galilee. The Q document came from an oral tradition put in writing around 20 to 30 AD. Here is a perfect example of a knowledge filter in action. Close attention to the manufacture of the Christian books has been heeded to in this Chronicon to illustrate how we have been manipulated and deceived in increments over the passage of centuries. In 430 AD, Theodore wrote, quote, I found myself upwards of 200 such books held in honour among the churches, and collecting them all together, I had them put aside, and instead introduced the Gospels of the four evangelists." Unquote. The Christian believer in Jesus has been offered a collection of books, heralded as authoritative accounts, books that took preeminence 250 years after they were written. These books written 150 years after the events they are supposed to relate. Had not the Roman Church adopted the four Gospels, then Christianity would have developed along entirely different lines, especially had the other 200 books, put aside, survived this censorship. 1. History in quotations. 2. The Gospel Truth. 3. The Christ Conspiracy. 4. A Quest for Answers. 5. History of the Christian Religion to the year 200. 16. The Bible Fraud. 186 AD, 4080 AM. Famous church historian Origen was born in this year. 188 AD, 4082 AM. A comet appeared as recorded by the Chinese. 1. Introduction to comets. 192 AD, 4086 AM. Tertullian wrote that, quote, "Regions of Britain which have never been penetrated by the Roman arms have received the religion of Christ." Unquote. There are historians that assert that Druidism dissolved by the natural action of its own principles into Christianity. 1. St. Paul in Britain. 200 AD, 4094 AM. Julius Africanus, died 245 AD, was the originator of the erroneous theory that the sons of God in Genesis 6, rebel Anunnaki Nephilim, and the giants, Anunnaki hybrid offspring, merely described a union between the daughters of Seth and Cainite males before the flood, and was not really referring to the appearance on earth of divine beings that descended from the heavens that was so popular in all the pagan histories. Despite the immense corpus of written and oral traditions of these visitors to early humanity and their gigantic offspring, the Church was attempting through its historians and bishops to distance itself from all pagan history. This was a time of heavy Christian filtering of knowledge. 203 AD, 4097 AM. At Roman Carthage in North Africa, the Christians were undergoing persecution. A woman named Perpetua was with her infant daughter and servant girl when they were taken and offered a chance to recant her faith or die. She refused to recant despite protests from local leaders and her father. She was herded in the Colosseum at Carthage with the other Christians, and she with her servant Felicity were hacked to death by a gladiator before a cheering crowd of Romans. The incident and fame of Perpetua spread throughout Christendom because while in prison awaiting her death, she wrote a diary that was afterwards published. 204 AD, 4098 AM. Plotinus Born, died 270 AD, a venerated Christian mystic, philosopher and writer. 207 AD, 4101 AM. The War of the Three Kingdoms began in China and lasted 58 years to 265 AD. Chuko Liang, known as Sleeping Dragon, led the armies of the Shu Kingdom. His enemy approached with 150,000 troops, catching Chuko alone with only a small force in a town, so he ordered his own men to throw down their flags, open the city gates and hide in the town as he stood alone on the city wall. He wore a Taoist robe, playing a lute and chanting, watching the approach of his arch-enemy Sima Yi, who stared back suspiciously. Seeing his nemesis on the wall alone with the gates wide open and nobody else around, Sima Yi panicked, sure that this was a clever ambush, ordering his army to retreat. In this way Sleeping Dragon escaped. This is a period of great confusion in China. 1. The 48 Laws of Power. 208 AD, 4102 AM. This is a year prominent in the calendrics of Rome, of the descendants of Israel and of China. This year was 1332 years, 666 plus 666, after the dynastic change that occurred in 1123 BC, when 250,000 Chinese took to ships and sailed to the ancient Americas. It was also 414 years after 207 BC, when Chinese Emperor Huangti died and China erupted into warring states. 210 AD, 4104 AM. This is a year that cannot be ignored in Chronicon. The calendrics are too strong. These are most significant timelines. Perhaps a more in-depth analysis of history can yield forth the events that occurred in this year. 221 AD, 4115 AM. Julius Africanus finished his Chronographia, a 5-volume history of the world from the supposed creation to 221 AD. 228 AD, 4122 AM. This year, 228 AD, is the earliest date found on any Mayan site inscription, written in the familiar Mayan bar and dot numerical system they inherited from the Olmecs. The Maya inherited their culture, sciences and calendar from the older Olmec of the Yucatan, and this is exactly 600 times 6 years after the start of the Olmec calendar in 3373 BC, and 666 times 5 years after the start of the Vedic calendar in 3103 BC. 1. Fingerprints of the Gods. 235 AD, 4129 AM. Maximin becomes Emperor of Rome, a man of Germania, of Scythian Goth descent. He stood 8 feet tall, was of enormous strength and very cruel. He reigned until 238. 240 AD, 4134 AM. Mani the Persian wrote the Book of Giants, a text not to be confused with the Dead Sea Scrolls text, also called Book of Giants, discovered in 1947 AD from the Qumran site. Mani was a reformer who believed that Christianity had become corrupted by the influence of Judaism. To him, Christianity was more akin to the Persian Zoroastrianism than to Judaism. He preached at a time after the Persians had liberated themselves from Parthian rule, but it was under the Parthians that Christianity had been allowed to flourish unobstructed. He founded Manichaeism. His death is variously dated between 274 and 277 AD. 1. Fallen angels. 2. The history of the Christian religion and the Church during the first 3 centuries. 246 AD, 4140 AM. Planet Phoenix passed through the inner solar system, completing its 138-year orbit. This year concludes exactly 10 cursed Earth periods of 414 years since mankind was banished in 3895 BC, which was 1656 years before the deluge. This year is 1656 years after the Israelites invaded Lower Syria in 1411 BC and conquered the kingdoms of Argob and Bashan. Now in 246 AD, the descendants of the Israelites, called the Goths, migrated in a full-scale invasion of the Roman province of Dacia, totally erasing this culture from history, either through violence or assimilation, probably both. The invasion of the Goths had a ripple effect through the Roman Empire. Roman civilization was supported by the institution of slavery, there being more slaves in many communities than freeborn people and citizens. The incursions of the non-slave-holding Goths and other Germanic cultures that defeated the legions and occupied Roman territories were looked upon favourably by the immense slave populations as liberators rather than conquerors. This was 1530 years before the descendants of these Goths founded the Christian nation of the United States of America in 1776 AD. 1. A short history of the world. 248 AD, 4142 AM. The Romans throughout the empire celebrated their 1000th year anniversary from Rome's founding in 753 BC. Throughout the Roman holdings, the circus was alive with celebration, games were held, and arenas boasted the slaughter of exotic animals. This was the 756th year of the Republic, founded in 509 BC, or 108 times 7 years. 1. History in quotations. 250 AD, 4144 AM. Emperor Decius begins to persecute Christians. He has the Bishop of Rome named Fabian executed. Earlier in Chronicon it had been noted a few times the connections Buddhism had with early Christianity, the similarities. Here we find that a number usually associated with evil and tragedy, 792, is connected to the Buddhist calendar in this very year of Christian persecution. As Christianity relates to the descendants of Israelites, this year is also connected to 1407 BC, when Israel became a nation 1656 years earlier, or 414 times 4 years. Also a sum involving cursed earth periods. Further, as the Great Flood was the termination of the ancient world and the beginning of another timeline, we see this year as 2488 after flood, or 1244 plus 1244 years. The number 1244 over and over again associated to Israelitish peoples. 1. The Jesus Papers. 251 AD, 4145 AM. The Gothic army defeated the Roman forces at Abritus, killing Emperor Decius and his son at the Dobruja swamp. 1. The God Kings of Europe. 258 AD, 4152 AM. Pope Stephen I of Rome sought to justify why the bishops of Rome had preeminence among all bishops elsewhere, because they had followed Peter, though the evidence that Peter was ever in Rome has been historically lacking. Also in this year, Emperor Valerian ordered the execution of all Christian bishops, priests, and deacons. Many indeed were rounded up and killed. This was 1260 years after the throne of David was established in 1003 BC. 1. The Jesus Papers. 259 AD. Roman Emperor Valerian and his troops are captured by the Celts from the north, a complete embarrassment to the Romans. 260 AD, 4154 AM. Sapor I, the second Sassanid Shah of Persia, captured the city of Antioch, but the Shah did not survive the year, for he was killed on his way back to Persia by Odenathus of Palmyra. 264 AD, 4158 AM. Emperor Constantine divides the Roman Empire into eastern and western political divisions, this being the fulfillment of biblical prophecies recorded in the book of Daniel. The legs of iron prophecy began with the head of gold, Babylon, in 603 BC, a fulfillment that would count down 1080 years to the fall of Rome in 476 AD, which would be in two divisions, two legs. This was the 1018th year of Rome, 1018 being 509 plus 509, and in 509 BC the Republic of Rome began. Also in this year began the Christian Coptic calendar of Alexandria, Egypt, which commemorated Emperor Diocletian's persecution and martyrdom of Christians. As this is the start of a new calendar, we find it connected by the golden proportion number to another calendar, the Seleucid calendar, by 576 years. In the prophecies of Daniel, the Seleucid and Egyptian Ptolemaic dynasties are described as having their origin with Alexander of Macedon, the Brass Empire. This calendar counts 1776 years, major golden proportion number, to the destruction of the Western world and a quarter of humanity in 2040 AD by Phoenix transit, which fulfills the prophecies of the sixth seal of the Apocalypse. As calendars go, this was the year 1480 of the ancient Chinese calendar that started in 1197 BC. 1. Alexandria. 270 AD, 4164 AM. The Goths invade the cities of the Balkans, which were settled by earlier migrating descendants of Israel in 603 BC. Roman Emperor Aurelius defeated the Goths, killing their king Cannabords. This initiated the split of the Gothic kingdom, creating the Turvingi, Visigoths of the west, and the Grutungi, Ostrogoths of the east. This year was the 1200th of the divided kingdom, since Israel and Judah split in 931 BC. Further, this was 1480 years since Israel conquered Argob and Bashan in Lower Syria in 1411 BC. This was also 600 years after 331 BC, when the Macedonian king Alexander had become the king of Babylon, Persia, Egypt, and the king of the West in biblical prophecy. This is 1776 years to 2046 AD, when, as recorded by Nostradamus, the entire Western world will die. 1. The God Kings of Europe. 274 AD, 4168 AM. Mani the Persian, founder of the Manichaeans, persecuted by Zoroastrians throughout his ministry, is flayed and crucified by order of Bahram I of the Sassanid dynasty in Persia. He met his death sometime between 274 and 277. 1. Zoroastrianism. 2. A Short History of the World. 284 AD, 4178 AM. Diocletian's first year of rule as Roman Emperor. Diocletian's parents had been slaves in the house of Anolinus, a Roman senator. Diocletian was a soldier who emerged through the ranks of the military by his achievements. He institutes many economic reforms as well as legislative, radically altering the structure of the Roman government, many historians claiming that he brought life back into the Roman Empire. He strengthened the two halves of the Roman Empire. He ordered the destruction of all Christian libraries. This was 2730 years after the Exodus and receiving of the law in 1447 BC, being 390 times 7. The prophet Ezekiel learned that 390 years was a period of judgment, and in the Levitical law we read that God, quote, will chastise and discipline you 7 times more for your sins, unquote. This 7 times 390 years is 2730 years to 284 AD, when Diocletian's great persecution began. This was 4320 years of the orbital chronology, being 1080 times 4, and 868 years after the fall of Judah in 585 BC. Further, this was 2160 years after the institution of the Abrahamic covenant in 1877 BC, and the 792nd year of the Roman Republic founded in 509 BC. In this year were rediscovered the golden inscriptions concerning the Great Pyramid read to King Philippus in 498 BC. 1. History of the First Council of Nicea. 2. Elder Gods in Antiquity. 285 AD, 4179 AM. Diocletian assembled the Roman armies at La Valais and held a pagan festival of sacrifice in honour of the Roman gods. But the commander of the Theban legion, Mauritius, refused to bow before the pagan gods, and Maximian threatened to decimate his entire legion, killing every 10th man. Mauritius protested, a Manichaean Christian. He stepped forward and offered his own life to be taken first. He was killed, and his captains were moved by the display of passive resistance, so they too stepped forward and were killed, refusing to bow to Roman gods. Then the entire legion was decimated, but still the remaining soldiers of the Theban legion refused to yield, preferring to die with their Christian faith intact. Maximian then made the terrible decision to behead the entire Theban legion, and this was carried out. 6,666 soldiers were killed rather than bowing to Rome's pagan deities. This event was precisely 250 years after the 33 AD crucifixion event, and the news of the unyielding faith of these legionnaires lit a fire throughout Rome that no emperor could put out. In fact, this single event in the history of the later Roman Empire was the cause that made Rome decades later adopt Christianity as its official religion. 1. The Spear of Destiny. 293 AD, 4187 AM. Diocletian's persecution of Christians now carries over into the British Isles, 10,000 Christians and several bishops being slaughtered. He reconstitutes the Roman Empire into a tetrarchy, essentially creating a 4-Caesar government. 1. Tracing our ancestors. 296 AD, 4190 AM. Diocletian had esoteric and Christian books burned at Alexandria, Egypt, and the Greek city of Byzantium. 1. Egypt, child of Atlantis. 303 AD, 4197 AM. Diocletian initiates the Great Persecution against Christianity, which would last 10 years until 313 AD. Some believe these 10 years refers to the 10 days predicted in the book of Revelation that the believers of Christ would endure. This year is 270 years after the 33 AD crucifixion event. An edict of Diocletian called for the destruction of all Christian books. Eusebius wrote that many leading and new Christians were tortured and executed. Nicomedia in Bithynia, an early stronghold of Christianity and founded by descendants of migrating Israelites, who once occupied Ugarit until 855 BC, had 600 Christians shut up in their church at order of Diocletian. The church was set on fire and they all died. Also in this year, Hierocles wrote in his Philaletheses that the Jesus story was totally manufactured around the life and deeds of a remarkable Samaritan named Apollonius, who had been born in 2 BC. 1. The Gospel Truth. Also a quest for answers. 2. History and quotations. 3. History of the First Council of Nicea. 4. The Christ Conspiracy. 306 AD, 4200 AM. Constantine comes to power, a man from the city of York in Britain, already an ancient city and international port. Also in this year, a large group of the people of Pontus, a people descended from Israelites of the tribe of Benjamin, departed Cappadocia and sailed to the Atlantic, around the coast of Europe, reaching Norway, where they settled in a heavily forested land, where they would emerge centuries later as the historic Vikings, their cultural standard being that of the wolf. In the Old Testament we find the house of Benjamin represented by the wolf standard, and in the prophecy of Jacob, Israel, in Genesis, we read, quote, Benjamin shall raven as a wolf, in the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil, unquote. As the Vikings, the people of Pontus would eventually found a vast Scandinavian empire from Russia to the British Isles, drew their Norman descendants as far south as Byzantium, and eventually helped populate the Americas. This year was 21 Jubilees after the 10 tribes of Israel were carried away captive into Assyria, and 1944 years after Manasseh and Ephraim were adopted into the family of Israel in 1639 BC. This was 552 years after the founding of the last great partial Israelite dynasty in 247 BC, that of the Parthians in Mesopotamia. 1. The Bible fraud. History in quotations. 2. Tracing our ancestors. 312 AD, 4206 AM. Emperor Galerius continued the persecution of Christians. Constantine deported Britain and crossed the Atlantic Channel with an army of Britons, consulting the Sibylline books before defeating his rival Maxentius at Milvan Bridge. Constantine reports that he saw a cross in the sky with words that commanded him to use the cross as a symbol when conquering, and we are told that this led to his conversion to Christianity. Most historians believe that this is a fiction perpetuated by him to gain popularity with the rising Christian population throughout the empire. In this year, Eusebius wrote Chronicon, a chronology based off of data provided by Alexander Polyhistor in the 1st century BC, as well as extracts from the lost works of the Babylonian historian Berossus. This year was 1242 years since Israel and Judah split in 931 BC, and 1056 years since the 10 tribes were deported in 745 BC, 1056 mirroring the year 1056 Annus Mundi, 2839 BC, when Noah was born, a type of saviour in the first year of the oppression. 1. The Bible fraud. 2. Elder gods in antiquity. 313 AD, 4207 AM. Constantine published the Edict of Milan throughout the empire, ending the persecution of Christians. This was an edict of toleration for Christianity, not, as claimed by many theologians, an official adoption of Christianity for the Roman state. 1. A quest for answers. 314 AD. The Christian Council of Arles is held on the continent. That Britain boasted a large Christian population at this early date is found in that 3 British bishops were in attendance. 1. Tracing our ancestors. 317 AD, 4211 AM. The beginning of the late Mayan dynasty at Tikal, an ancient pyramid city with a history dating far into the archaic past. Mayan stelae, interpreted by archaeologists, reveal that in this year began an unbroken line of kings at Tikal to the year 869 AD, a dynasty lasting 552 years. 1. The Lost Realm, Sky Watchers in the Jungle, Sitchin. 321 AD, 4215 AM. Constantine issued a decree officially honouring the first day of the week as Sunday. It was the bishops of Rome that urged this unification of paganism. This was 288 years after the 33 AD crucifixion event, 1 Planet in Rebellion. 324 AD, 4218 AM, Constantine became the sole emperor of the Roman Empire, there being over 5 million known Christians at this time under his rule. He had been born in Britain to a Christian woman named Helena. Sozomen wrote, quote, "It is well known the great Constantine received his Christian education in Britain," unquote. And Melanchthon wrote that, quote, "Helena was unquestionably a British princess," unquote. Eusebius, a close confidant of Constantine, wrote that some of Christ's own apostles had early on visited Britain. We do not know if these early records are reliable or the manipulation of facts to best favour Constantine ex post facto. This year is 1728 years to 2052 AD, when another empire unifying its political and religious spheres will begin under the Antichrist. 1. The Gospel Truth. 2. Tracing our ancestors. 3. St. Paul in Britain. 325 AD, 4219 AM. Constantine holds the Council of Nicea, including 318 bishops held in Bithynia. One of the major results of this council was the condemnation of a branch of Christianity, known then as Arianism, and one of the decrees of the council called for the burning of all writings by Arius and the penalty of death to all those caught with copies of his books. Eusebius himself was banished because of his leaning toward Arianism, though he was later called back. There has been a persistent rumour among theologians that this council edited the books of the Christians, creating the canon of the New Testament we know of today. But this is not true. 20 rulings were issued from this council, and all their contents exist today. Not one concerns the canon. The origin of this fiction is traced to Voltaire, who used as his own source a suspicious document dated about 887 AD, Vetus Synodicon, written 560 years after the council was held. 1. History of the First Council of Nice. 3. A Quest for Answers. 326 AD, 4220 AM. The official Roman Church rejected Passover and established Easter as the official Christian holiday, a day venerating Ashtoreth or Ishtar, an archaic Mesopotamian fertility goddess. By adopting the spiritual heritage of Babylon, Rome became the New Babylon. This inheritance of the spirit of Babylon occurred exactly 864 years after the fall of Babylon to Persia in 537 BC. The Easter bunny, a rabbit, is an old fertility symbol. 330 AD, 4224 AM. The ancient city of Greek Byzantium was founded in 661 BC, and in this year, 990 years later, or 330 times 3, in 330 AD, the Emperor Constantine relocates the seat of the Roman Empire from Rome to Byzantium, changing its name to Constantinople. The city of Rome in Italy continues, with success, to assume the powers of authority over the rapidly growing Christian world, as the political power of empire is transferred to Byzantium. Constantine takes with him a huge library of Christian texts to Byzantium. In this year, the Greek historian of Roman histories, Ammianus Marcellinus, is born. The descendants of Israel have literally filled the continents of Europe, much of Asia and northern Africa, and the calendrics for this year are very important. This year was the exact midpoint between the exodus of Israel from Egypt in 1447 BC, that happened 1776 years earlier, and the Great War of Armageddon in 2106 AD, or 6000 Annus Mundi, precisely 1776 years after 330 AD. This was 4,000 years since the years were counted, according to Jewish chroniclers, and it is 3168 years since the Anunnaki dynasty was founded before the flood in 2839 BC, or 792 times 4. This was also 1736 years after Israel was born as a nation in 1407 BC, or 4 judged time epochs. This year was also 1260 years after the divided kingdom chronology began, and 1584 years after the Israelite Danaan dynasty of Mycenae was founded in 1255 BC. 1. The Archco volume. 337 BC, 4231 AM. Constantine the Great died, and the Roman Empire is divided between his three sons, Constantine, Constantius, and Constans. Theirs will be a struggle one against the others for supremacy. 351 AD, 4245 AM. A brilliant comet like a cross appeared in the sky, witnessed by Cyril and the people of Jerusalem. It shined like the sun for several hours before disappearing. 1. Jesus, God, man, or myth. 354 AD, 4248 AM. Pope Liberius formally declared that the birthday of Jesus was December 25th, which he knew was the birthday of Mithras. This was also the birthday of many saviour gods who were crucified, deities all venerated before Christianity. Augustine of Hippo was born in this year, famous Christian historian, author of City of God. This year was the origin of Christmas, a Christian holiday that would become the most celebrated holiday on earth throughout the Western world. As the descendants of Israel have filled the Western world, we are not surprised to find these calendrics. Mithras was an Eastern and earlier version of Jesus, and the Eastern Vedic calendar of the Kali Yuga began 3456 years priorly, or 864 times 4. This was 3168 Anno Pyramid, or 792 times 4, the pyramid being the seal of Israel. This was 2592 years after the deluge, or 864 times 3, and it was 1800 years, 600 times 3, after the Exodus in 1447 BC, and 600 years after the Parthian dynasty was founded in Mesopotamia in 247 BC, where Mithraism flourished. Lastly, this was 666 years after the start of the Syrian Seleucid dynasty calendar in 313 BC, Syria being the cradle land of Christianity. 1. The 48 Laws of Power. 367 AD, 4251 AM. The fixed Jewish calendar was instituted in this year, a system that approximated the new moons by which the calendar of the Hebrews was to be measured. It had become difficult for the Jews, a widespread race separated in their communities, from keeping the same calendar. Roman Emperor Constantius, son of Constantine the Great, erected an obelisk taken from Thebes in Upper Egypt. His father had priorly removed the monument from Egypt and brought it to Italy on a gigantic boat, requiring 300 rowers up the Nile and over the Mediterranean. Thousands of labourers using pulleys and cranks were needed to lift the stone relic into a standing position. This was 324 years, 108 times 3, after the 33 AD crucifixion event. 1. Ammianus Marcellinus, Book 17. 358 AD, 4252 AM. Terrible earthquakes shook the cities of Macedonia, Asia, Pontus, Bithynia, with Nicomedia, the capital of Bithynia, taking the worst. At dawn on August 24th, the clear sky quickly gave way to thick masses of black clouds that descended to the ground, blotting out the sun, rendering everything invisible. Ammianus Marcellinus reports that the unusual destruction began from the sky in the form of loud crashes, winds, fatal thunderbolts, and a torrential downpour, which was all accompanied by an earthquake. Just as fast as it occurred, the quake ceased, the sky cleared, and a beautiful day was ruined by the sight of broken cities with thousands of torn bodies among the piles of debris. Survivors were transfixed on sharp timbers to die slowly, while others were buried alive under the rubble, where their moans were heard unceasingly until they expired. Many people trapped in the lower recesses of the building starved to death, and a fire spread through the broken city of Nicomedia, burning alive all those trapped in the ruins. By this time all these cities were Christian. This was the 900th year of the Buddhist calendar, from 543 BC. Jewish Rabbi Hillel III popularized the Jewish fixed calendar, his own invention, for the Jewish festivals and holy days, but this was in direct contravention to divine decree in the Old Testament statutes, which mandated calendrical periods to be observed by lunar phases. Interestingly, by coincidence, this calendar started 360 years after 2 BC birth of Christ. Hillel III wrote, quote, After having viewed our present condition, it may be well for us to look back and review our former history, and get a knowledge of the state of the world in former times. Unquote. 1. Ammianus Marcellinus, Book 17. 359 AD, 4253 AM. At the city of Antioch in Syria, now called the Jewel of the East, one of the four major cities of the Roman Empire, in a suburb called Daphne, a child was born with two heads, a beard and very small ears, the population announcing the birth of a monster. Also in this year, Rome and Persia begin 3 years of intense war. 1. Ammianus Marcellinus, Book 19. 362 AD, 4256 AM. On December the 5th, an earthquake finished off the city of Nicomedia, destroying what little was left or rebuilt after the quake in 358. Much of Nicea was also destroyed, the two quakes being 52 months apart. 1. Ammianus Marcellinus, Book 22. 363 AD, 4257 AM. In the 6th year of the passing of the Romanid Apocalypse comet group, several comets were seen at the same time, some in broad daylight. Constantinople, Byzantium, was shaken by an earthquake, and Emperor Julian Augustus witnessed a bright meteor. Etruscan diviners asserted that the omen was bad for anyone thinking to invade another's country, using as their authority the ancient Tarquitian books of the Sibyl. Nevertheless, Julian, called the Apostate, prepares to invade Persia. Julian was of the family of Constantine the Great, and fantasized about leaving a great monument to posterity to perpetuate the memory of his reign. His chief idea fell upon the restoration of the temple in Jerusalem, which his predecessors Vespasian and Titus destroyed with great difficulty, then finished the devastation with General Julius Severus of Britain. Julian's work forces could not carry out the rebuilding of the temple because of strange fiery explosions from the ground that burned the men the project abandoned. Julian invades Persia and wars against the Sassanids, laying waste to fortresses and towns in Mesopotamia, even crossing the Euphrates River and marching his troops all the way to the Persian Gulf. After several victories, his men starved because of the Persians employing scorched earth tactics. He unwisely burned his own ships and was killed in battle. Jovian ascends the throne and immediately is assassinated for negotiating a peace settlement with Persia that relinquished Roman territory. Julian was a scholar and philosopher, called the Apostate because he refused to believe in the divinity of Jesus. He wrote, quote, "Jesus and Paul have surpassed all magicians and impostors that have ever lived. Neither Paul nor Matthew nor Luke nor Mark dared to say that Jesus was God, but John began the concept." Unquote. 1. Ammianus Marcellinus, Book 25. For the Gospel Truth. 364 AD, 4258 AM. In the Council of Laodicea, the Roman Church officially, with government support, declared that the Roman world would henceforth observe Sunday as the first day of the week and the day of rest, formally abolishing the Sabbath in violation of the Ten Commandments. Quote, "Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy." Unquote. Also in its council, the Passover was abolished, also dating from 1447 BC at the Exodus. This council successfully separated Christianity from those institutions considered Jewish, though both the Sabbath and Passover were ancient Israelite observations. The council consisted of 32 bishops from all the Asiatic churches. At this council, the New Testament books were discussed, and the Asian church agreed on which ones they venerated. As this was the Council of Laodicea, and the Apocalypse or Book of Revelation was prefixed with a warning to the Laodiceans, we are not surprised that they omitted Revelation from their own canon. The world is at war. Persia invaded Armenia, a former territory of Rome, and German tribes invaded Roman provinces. The Alemanni ravaged Gaul and Rhaetia. The Sarmatians and Quadi were laying waste to Pannonia, and Britain suffered onslaughts from the Picts, Scots, Saxons, and Attocotai. Goths invaded Thrace and Moesia, while in the southern provinces of Africa, the Moors and Ostoriani were raiding Roman allies and settlements. This year is 408 years in the Roman Julian calendar, or 2448 plus 2448 months, and 1447 BC was 2448 Annus Mundi. 1. National Sunday Law. 2. History of the Christian religion to the year 200. 3. Ammianus Marcellinus, Book 26. 365 AD, 4259 AM. On July 21st, an earthquake shook Alexandria, Egypt, in the 8th year of the passing of the Roman Apocalypse Comet Group. Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote that the quake was preceded by fierce lightning and thunder which continued through the quaking. The sea off the coast of Egypt where Alexandria was located receded, withdrawing far away from the shore, and the people found themselves far inland, looking out over an immense drying region of stranded fish and shelled creatures trapped in the mud, vast valleys and mountains where the sea had been before. As a great throng of people went out to gather fish, a tsunami came rushing back at hundreds of miles an hour, overtaking them. The wave and returning sea rushed up the coast and drowned the city of Alexandria, even depositing ships atop buildings. When the waters subsided and drained from the city and coastal regions, many more people were pulled out to sea to drown. Approximately 50,000 people died. In his History of the Later Roman Empire, Marcellinus relates that this disaster overwhelmed the world, surpassing anything related either in legend or authentic history, his opinion. He wrote that the quake was felt from Egypt into the Aegean and that towns and buildings on coasts were destroyed when the sea was removed from its bed. Even in the Aegean, ships were deposited far inland, some still holding their dead passengers. Near Methone in the Peloponnesus, he personally surveyed such a wrecked vessel. He wrote that, quote, "The whole face of the earth was changed by a mad conflict of the elements." Unquote. Ammianus was Greek, a Roman citizen having been born at Antioch. His amazing book, only one single copy surviving, and that dated from the 9th century AD, also relates that underneath the Great Pyramid were subterranean passages and winding retreats, quote, "which men skilled in the ancient mysteries, by means of which they divined the coming flood, constructed in different places lest the memory of all their sacred ceremonies should be lost." 1. Great Disasters. 2. Marcellinus, Book 26. 3. The Secret Doctrine. 366 AD, 4260 AM. The Goth-Roman War began, which would end in 369 with a peace settlement. This year was 1776 years after the Israelites conquered Lower Syria in 1411 BC, and it was 1296 years of the divided kingdom since 931 BC. Pope Damasus I of Rome murdered his rivals, and he established the untrue doctrine that the Church of Rome was the authoritative successors of the holy apostles of Jesus. He also created the doctrine of papal endorsement, meaning that a belief could not be accepted as true unless endorsed by the Pope. His secretary was the famous scholar Jerome, who he advised to revise the Holy Scriptures, the papacy introducing subtle alterations that would justify its positions. 1. End of Empire. 2. The Jesus Papers. 367 AD, 4261 AM. Athanasius provides us the first list of New Testament books as we have them today. This amazing date is linked perfectly with the calendrical signature of Israel. The people of Israel, obeying the word of God in 2488 AM, 1407 BC, followed Joshua in the conquest of Canaan and became a nation, inheriting lands promised to them in the Abrahamic covenant. 2488 is 1244 plus 1244, and this year of 367 AD is exactly 1244 years to the publication of the Holy Bible in English, in the Authorized King James Version in 1611 AD. The ancient Israelites were told by the prophets that they would in the future receive the word of the Lord in an unknown tongue. 1. A Quest for Answers. 368 AD, 4262 AM. In the 11th year of the passing of the Roman Apocalypse Comet Group, A comet appeared in the sky, shining brighter than the sun, according to the report of Kyrillus. A Christian bishop, a Goth named Ulfilas, ministered to the Visigoths and translated the Gospels into their language, essentially creating for them a Gothic vernacular in doing so. While living in Dacia along the Black Sea coast, the kingdom of the Visigoths were converted to Christianity. Ulfilas died in 382. This was the year 1080 since Jerusalem was delivered from the Assyrians in 713 BC, and the dark satellite passes by Earth too closely, and the solar year became altered from 360 days to 365.25. 1. Three Books of Occult Philosophy. 369 AD, 4263 AM. The Goth-Roman War ends with a peace settlement after Emperor Valens and the Gothic commander Athanaric met on a boat moored in the middle of the Danube River. 1. The End of Empire. 370 AD, 4264 AM. As the ancient Israelites had crossed the Jordan River into the land of promise in 1407 BC, exactly 1776 years earlier, now their Gothic descendants crossed the Danube River into Europe with the permission of the Roman Emperor led by their Christian leader Ulfilas, the bishop, whom the Goths considered their own personal Moses. They were among the first of the Germanic kin kingdoms to accept Christianity. The 1407 BC date is reflected isometrically in that counting 1407 years after 370 AD finds us in 1777 AD, within a year of the American Declaration of Independence from Britain. Further, the Goths were one of the 10 kingdoms that emerge in Europe after the fall of Rome in 476 AD, which is 1300 years before the founding of the United States of America in 1776 AD, and 1300 years before 370 AD was the year Israel broke away as 10 tribes from Judah in 931 BC. The calendrical isometric projections of 370 AD identify the Goths as the children of Israel. 1. Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 4. 372 AD, 4266 AM. The Huns from Asia began their excursion into Western Europe, pillaging, murdering, and raping. The kingdom of the Ostrogoths is defeated by the Huns and they become a vassal state, their men conscripted into the Hunnic army. Those communities that resisted the Huns had their men executed, their children enslaved, and their women raped in a widespread insemination program. This was 296 years after the Huns invaded India, or 3552 months, 1776 plus 1776. 1. Saxons, Vikings and Celts. 375 AD, 4269 AM. The Huns migrated with their families in tow, living in covered wagons. Their origin is a mystery. They overwhelmed the Goths near the Black Sea. They left no written records, and all accounts of them are filtered through the prejudicial eyes of their Roman enemies. Though described as barbarians, they were expert administrators with a well-organised military. The Gothic leader Athanaric of the Tervingi went to aid the Goths in the north, who were being pushed back by the Huns. The Huns attacked his camp at night and scattered the Tervingi. Several comets seen in the sky, according to Marcellinus. Workers removing old walls at the historic city of Chaldicon for rebuilding material to be used for the baths of Constantinople, Byzantium, happened upon a square block of old masonry which had an earlier Greek inscription which was prophetic. Quote, "And what once a city wall shall serve, oh, what a mournful change, to guard a bath! Then countless hordes of men from lands afar shall cross fair Ister's river, lance in hand, and lay all Scythia and Mysia waste. Next on Paeonia turn their mad career, to spread there likewise naught but death and strife." Unquote. This was deemed a prophecy of an invasion of foreign people into the realm, and at this exact time the Huns were invading northern Europe, and the fleeing Goths and other Germanic tribes migrated further west and south to escape them, the Huns capturing men, women and children as well as livestock. The Huns were unknown to the Romans, and their appearance on the world scene, coupled with the stories filtering in from the outer frontiers of wholesale slaughter, provoked dread and wonder throughout the empire. 1. The End of Empire. 2. Ammianus Marcellinus, Book 30.